Hello, my friend. I'm so glad you're here tonight. Before we begin, this little channel only exists because people like you quietly decide it's worth a small gesture. If these peaceful stories have ever helped you relax or drift off to sleep, subscribing simply makes it easier to find your way back the next time you need a quiet evening like this one. Leaving a like helps too. It costs nothing, and it means more than you might think. While you're settling in, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. Maybe a quiet evening in Yorkshire, a peaceful little village somewhere in the English countryside, or a calm night just outside Ontario, with the day slowly coming to an end. Leave it in the comments. Always enjoy reading every single one. All right, love. Dim the lights. Let your body grow heavy. Comfortable? Good. Let us begin. It does not begin with the manor house or the frost patterns on some grand window somewhere, or a carriage crossing a bridge in the snow. It begins smaller than that. It begins with a cottage with 2 rooms downstairs and 1.5 upstairs, its thatch gone soft and grey with age, sitting low against a hedge on the edge of an English village that never once appeared on a map anyone important ever drew. The first snow of the winter has come in the night. The real snow, the kind that means business, not the thin scatter that melted by noon 3 weeks before. It has settled over the fields in a single unbroken sheet, over the bare black hedgerows, over the roof of the cottage itself where it sits heavy and quiet, 6 inches deep and still coming down in slow, fat flakes that seem to be in no particular hurry to reach the ground. Smoke rises from the chimney in a thin grey column that bends once gently, before the wind takes it sideways over the fields. Somewhere under all that white a rooster has decided against all evidence that it is still morning and is saying so. Inside, the cottage is dark except for the fire. Sarah Whitlock stands at the window in her nightgown and a shawl pulled tight over her shoulders, one hand on the curtain she's just drawn back, and she does not move for a long moment. She's 34 years old. She's seen 11 winters in this house since she married into it, and she still, every single year, stops like this at the first real snow. Not from surprise, from something closer to reverence, though she would never call it that out loud. Not even to herself. Behind her, the room is stirring. A small shape presses itself against the glass of the other window, palm flat, breath fogging the pane in a widening circle. That is Grace, 9 years old, and she has not said a single word since she got out of bed, which is unlike her, because Grace has an opinion about most things and is not shy about sharing it. But snow does something to her. It always has. In the corner, under the good wool blanket, a smaller shape is very deliberately not moving. Ted is 6, and he has worked out with the particular cunning of a 6-year-old that if he stays completely still, morning cannot officially begin, and therefore the cold floor cannot yet be his problem. William is already dressing by the last of the firelight, pulling on a second shirt over the first, then a waistcoat, then a heavy coat that has done 12 winters and shows every one of them at the elbows. He does this without hurry and without complaint, the way a man does something he has done every winter of his adult life. Outside, the horse can be heard shifting in the small lean-to stable, hooves scraping against frozen straw, breath clouding in the cold. There is bread to be had in the village, and lamp oil, and a few other things that will not wait, and William has learned, the hard way, more than once, what happens to a lane like this one when the snow keeps coming and nobody has thought to travel it, while it is still passable. He crouches by the hearth and builds the fire up higher than it needs to be for breakfast alone, because he will not be here to tend it through the morning, and Sarah's hands will be full enough without also fighting a dying fire. Extra wood comes in from the stack outside the back door, armful after armful, stamped free of snow before it crosses the threshold, stacked neat and high beside the hearth. Somewhere under the eaves, a water barrel has begun, just at its surface, to grow a skin of ice, thin as a coin, and William breaks it with the flat of his hand out of habit before he fills the kettle, the way his own father taught him to, years and years before any of this was his to manage. There is a crock of butter that came in from the dairy the evening before, and Sarah moves it now from the cool pantry shelf to somewhere less cold but still shielded, and beside it a sack of flour gets pulled a little further from the outer wall, where damp and chill creep in along the stone no matter how good the mortar. These are not dramatic gestures. Nobody remarks on them. They are simply what gets done, quietly. In the last hour before a man leaves a house for the day, Grace finally speaks, wanting to know if it will keep snowing all day. William tells her, without looking up from the boot he is lacing, that it looks that way. She asks if she can go out in it, and he tells her, simply, after. She accepts this the way children accept most postponements, which is to say reluctantly, and returns to watching the flakes fall past the window, tracking one all the way from the grey sky down to the white ground, then choosing another and starting over. By the time William leads the horse and cart out from behind the cottage, the family has gathered at the window without quite deciding to, the way people do when something is ending and they want to watch it happen properly. Sarah has Ted on her hip now, wrapped in the wool blanket he refused to leave earlier, and Grace stands pressed against her mother's side. The cart wheels leave 2 dark lines behind them in the white of the lane, already beginning to soften at the edges as more snow falls into them. William lifts one hand without turning around, a small gesture, more habit than announcement, and then the lane bends behind the hedge, and he is gone, swallowed into the white and the grey and the soft, steady falling of the season's first real snow. Nobody says anything for a moment. Then Sarah sets Ted down and turns back toward the fire, and the day, such as it is, begins. There is a pair of thick knitted slippers that lives permanently near the hearth for exactly this kind of morning, passed between whoever's feet happen to need them most at a given moment, and this particular morning it is Grace who claims them first, tucking her feet up beneath her on the stool, with the satisfied air of someone who has won a small daily contest most mornings actually go the other way. Ted, denied the slippers, contents himself instead with standing directly on the warm hearthstone itself, close enough to the fire's heat that his mother reminds him, out of long habit rather than any real present danger, to mind the distance. The fire has settled into that low, steady roar it gets once it has caught properly, and the room has already begun to warm in the particular way a small stone cottage warms, unevenly, in patches, so that standing 3 feet from the hearth feels like a different season entirely from standing by the door. Sarah sets a pan directly into the coals at the edge of the fire and breaks 2 eggs into it, and the sound they make, that quick hiss and crackle, is somehow one of the most comforting sounds in the entire house. Grace has claimed the stool nearest the fire without asking, the way the oldest child usually manages to, and Ted has forgotten his earlier stubbornness entirely, now that there is bread toasting on a long fork held out toward the coals. Breakfast, when it comes, is simple. Bread from yesterday, toasted hard and gone slightly smoky at the edges, spread with butter that melts almost the instant it touches the warm crust. The eggs. A little milk warmed near the fire for the children, and something darker and stronger in Sarah's own cup, brewed weak because tea is not cheap and does not need to be strong to still feel like a small luxury on a cold morning. They eat close together, knees nearly touching, because the fire only truly reaches so far into the room and nobody wants to sit at the far edge of its warmth when they do not have to. Ted announces, with the flat confidence of a 6-year-old delivering bad news he does not actually believe, that Papa's cart will get stuck. Grace tells him he won't, that he's done it 100 times, and Ted insists not in this much snow, and Grace insists right back, in more than this. Sarah does not correct either of them, because arguing children by the fire on a snowy morning is its own kind of warmth, familiar and easy, and she lets it run its course while she finishes her tea. There is a particular ritual to the clothes that come out once breakfast is cleared, one that has nothing to do with fashion and everything to do with the simple arithmetic of staying warm through a day that will not climb much above freezing even at its brightest hour. The light autumn things, the single wool dresses and the thin stockings that did well enough through October, go back into the chest at the foot of the bed, folded and put away until spring with something close to relief. In their place come the heavier things, a second petticoat, flannel rather than cotton. stockings knitted thick enough to feel almost like a second skin. For Sarah, a dress of dark wool that has done 4 winters already and will likely do several more, its hem let down twice over the years as fashion and thrift both required. For the children, extra layers pulled on with the particular squirming resistance. Children bring to being dressed for weather they cannot yet feel. Ted twisting away from a scratchy wool jumper his grandmother knitted the previous winter, insisting it itches, which it does, a little, though he will stop noticing within the hour. Sarah kneels to fasten Ted's boots and glances up once at the window, where the snow is still coming down steady and unhurried, exactly as it has been for the past 2 hours. Grace observes, from somewhere behind her, that it isn't stopping, and Sarah agrees. She doesn't think it means to. The morning settles into its shape after that. There is a rhythm to a cottage kitchen on a snowbound morning that has nothing urgent in it and everything necessary, and Sarah moves through it the way she moves through most mornings, without much conscious thought, the way you walk a familiar staircase in the dark. The fire wants tending every 20 minutes or so, not because it is dying, but because it wants watching, wants a log turned or added before it thinks about dying. And there is an entire small science to this that Sarah could not have explained in words but executes without hesitation. Too much wood at once and the fire smokes and sulks. Too little, and it gutters low just when you need it most, usually right as something is meant to be cooking. She has learned, the way most cottage wives learn, by getting it wrong enough times in her first winter married that getting it right now feels almost like an old habit rather than a skill. Outside the window, past Grace's breath-fogged circle of glass, the world has gone entirely white and entirely quiet in that particular way that only heavy, steady snowfall can manage, swallowing sound before it can properly travel. The lane where William's cartwheels left their 2 dark lines an hour ago has already smoothed itself back over. The tracks softened to faint impressions and then, as the children watch, gone altogether. Out past the low stone wall that marks the edge of their own small garden, the fields roll away white and empty toward the tree line, and it is only if you look carefully, and Grace does look carefully, that you can make out the darker thread of the stream where it cuts along the field's far edge, not yet frozen solid but slowing, the current sluggish beneath a skin of ice that has crept in from both banks and not yet met in the middle. Grace points and says the stream is freezing. Ted abandons whatever quiet mischief he has been engaged in near the wood box and comes to look, and for a moment both children simply watch it, this slow, patient thing happening to water that yesterday was still moving freely, and there is something in their stillness that suggests they understand, in whatever way children understand such things, that they are watching the season actually arrive rather than simply being told about it. There are chores even for children, this young, small ones suited to small hands, and Sarah sets Grace to work now with a task she has done every winter morning since she was old enough to be trusted with it, which is filling the kindling basket from the dry store just inside the back door, so that whoever tends the fire next does not have to go hunting for it. Ted, not quite old enough for anything requiring real judgment, is given the job of watching the milk warming near the fire and telling his mother the instant it looks like it might boil over, a task he takes with the wide-eyed seriousness of someone who's been handed genuine responsibility for the first time, which, in his own 6-year-old understanding, he more or less has been. Smoke rises from the neighbouring cottage too, visible through a gap in the hedge where the trees have not yet fully grown in. A thin grey line climbing straight up before the wind catches it and bends it sideways, just as their own smoke bends. Beyond that, further along the lane, another column, and another past that, thin grey threads rising from a scatter of low rooftops that make up the rest of the village, each one a small sign that inside some other cottage a fire is being tended just as carefully as this one, that some other family is doing more or less exactly what the Whitlocks are doing, dressing for the cold, watching the snow, waiting for someone to come back down a lane that has already begun to disappear beneath fresh white. William's journey into the village takes the better part of an hour, longer than it would on a clear day, because the horse picks its way carefully along a lane that has lost most of its usual landmarks beneath the white, and because twice he has to climb down and lead the animal by hand through a drift that has gathered deeper than the cartwheels want to manage. He does not mind the slowness of it, not really. There is something almost pleasant in a journey that asks nothing more of you than patience, and the fields on either side, usually a familiar green blur he barely registers anymore after years of the same route, have this morning become something worth looking at properly, transformed into a landscape of soft white hollows and dark bare hedgerow lines, the occasional startled blackbird bursting up out of a berry bush and scattering a small explosion of snow behind it. The village, when he reaches it, is smaller than a stranger might expect from the word village. A handful of cottages gathered loosely around a green that has vanished entirely beneath the snow, a church with a squat stone tower, and a general shop that also serves, depending on the day and the need, as post office, meeting place, and the closest thing the parish has to a source of actual news. Smoke rises from every chimney in sight. A dog barks somewhere behind one of the cottages and is answered by another further off. Two men stand talking outside the shop door, their breath visible, stamping their feet against the cold in a rhythm that has nothing to do with impatience and everything to do with simply staying warm while they finish whatever they were saying to each other. William ties the horse where it can shelter a little against the shop's wall and steps inside, where the low ceiling and the press of shelves and barrels make the room feel smaller and warmer than it has any real right to, especially with the door letting in a gust of cold air every time someone comes or goes. He is not the only one here on this particular morning, and there is a kind of unspoken understanding among the small cluster of men and women filling their baskets that everyone has come today for the same reason, which is to get what is needed before the roads decide to make the decision for them. The shopkeeper offers, weighing out flour onto the scale with the unhurried precision of a man who's done this exact motion 10,000 times before, that a bad one is coming. They're saying that his cousin over at the mill has had an aching knee since Tuesday, and that particular knee is never wrong. William allows that a knee that has never been wrong is worth listening to, and buys a little more than he strictly came for. Flour and a twist of tea and a small paper packet of sugar that Sarah did not ask for but will not turn away either, and a length of candle wick that has been on his mental list for over a week now and kept slipping his mind until this exact moment. There is a comfortable, unhurried quality to buying supplies in a shop where everyone knows your name and your family and roughly how many mouths you're feeding, a kind of quiet accounting that happens without anyone needing to say it aloud. Outside again, he exchanges a few words with a neighbour from 2 cottages down the lane, a widow named Mrs. Price who has come for lamp oil and looks, William thinks, a little too thin for a woman about to face a hard winter alone, though he does not say this, only asks after her chickens and mentions in the sideways manner men of this era tend to offer help without quite calling it help, that he has a bit of extra wood split this year if anyone finds themselves running short before spring. She thanks him in a way that suggests she has heard this particular kindness before, from him or from someone very like him, and that it will not be the last time this winter that neighbours quietly cover for each other's shortfalls without ever making a formal thing of it. The cart, loaded now, makes slower work of the return journey than the outward one did, the horse leaning into its collar with the steady patience of an animal that has done this before and knows, in whatever way a horse knows anything, that there is a warm stable and dry hay waiting at the end of it. William does not hurry it. There is no version of hurrying that would not risk more than it saved, not on a lane like this, in snow like this, and he has long since made his peace with what winter travel actually asks for, which is patience, and punishes anyone who tries to substitute speed for it. By the time the cottage comes back into view, low and grey thatched beneath its blanket of white, smoke still rising steady from the chimney, the snow has thinned slightly, not stopped, but eased into something gentler, fewer flakes, falling slower, as if the sky itself has decided the morning's real work is done and it can afford to relax a little into the afternoon. Back at the cottage, Sarah has spent the middle hours of the morning with her hands deep in a bowl of flour, working the dough for the week's bread, with the particular rhythm that comes from having done this same motion thousands of times before, Fold and press, fold and press, the heel of her palm doing most of the work while her fingers guide the edges back in. Bread is not a small undertaking in a house like this one. It is not something bought fresh each morning from somewhere down the road, not out here, and so what gets made must last, must be planned for, must account for a family of 4 through however many days pass before the next baking. She has learnt over the years exactly how much flour that means, exactly how the dough should feel under her hands when it has been worked enough and not too much, a knowledge that lives entirely in her fingers now, rather than in any recipe she could recite. The dough rises near the fire, covered with a cloth, in the warmest corner of the kitchen that is not actually the hearth itself, and while it does, Sarah turns her attention to the pot that will make up the day's main meal, a thick stew built mostly from what the autumn's harvest and preserving left them with, root vegetables that have been stored carefully through the cellar's cool dark, a little salted meat, barley for body, all of it going into the same pot to simmer slowly over the low edge of the fire for hours, filling the small kitchen gradually with a smell that has nothing elegant about it and everything comforting. Grace has been given a task of her own now, something that keeps her near the fire and out from underfoot, which is picking over a bowl of dried peas for the following week's soup, sorting out the occasional small stone or shriveled bad one, a task that requires just enough attention to keep a 9-year-old occupied without requiring so much that she cannot also chatter, which she does, steadily, about nothing in particular, about the snow, and about a girl at church who she has decided this week is her very best friend, and about whether the stream will freeze solid enough to walk on, which her mother tells her, without looking up from the dough, no, not this early in the season, and Grace accepts this with the particular disappointment of a child filing away information for future negotiation. Ted has grown bored of watching milk that is no longer boiling, and has migrated to the window again, where he has invented a game that consists entirely of trying to guess how many flakes will land on a particular dark patch of the stone windowsill before his mother tells him to come away from the draft, a game with no real winning condition but a great deal of solemn concentration behind it nonetheless. By the time William's cart is heard in the lane, the smell of the stew has filled the entire small house, and the bread has gone through its first rise and been shaped and set for its second, and the fire has been fed enough times that the whole downstairs has settled into a warmth that makes stepping outside, even for a moment, feel like a small shock to the system. William does not come straight in. There is the horse to see to first, always, before his own comfort, because a horse that has worked hard through cold and snow cannot simply be left standing while its owner warms himself by a fire, and William leads the animal into the small stable attached to the back of the cottage, rubbing it down with handfuls of straw until its coat is dry rather than merely damp, checking each hoof in turn for packed snow and ice that could bruise or worse if left, before finally forking out a generous measure of hay and refilling the water trough, breaking the thin new ice that has already begun forming across its surface even in the short time he was inside the shop. Only once all of this is done, the animal settled and blanketed and clearly comfortable, does he allow himself to think about his own cold hands and the fire waiting inside. He brings the supplies in stamping snow from his boots at the threshold, out of habit as much as necessity, and the kitchen greets him with warmth and the smell of stew and the particular chaos of 2 children both trying to tell him something different at the same moment, Grace about the frozen stream and Ted about his flake-counting game, and Sarah simply looks at him over both their heads, a small private look that says more than either child's chatter, checking without words that the journey went as it should have. Once he has a moment, hanging his coat by the door where it will drip its melting snow onto the flagstones rather than the good rug, he tells her the roads are bad, that they won't be much worse getting through by cart after today, he'd wager, and that it was a good thing they went when they did. Sarah nods, unsurprised, already having assumed as much from the length of time he was gone, and asks after Mrs. Price. Thin, William tells her, which is answer enough between 2 people who have discussed this particular neighbour's situation before, and Sarah's mouth sets in a small, thoughtful line that suggests she will think of some quiet, unremarkable way to send something over before the week is out, a loaf, perhaps, or a portion of the stew now simmering, delivered with some excuse about having made too much, the way such things are always managed between people who understand pride and do not wish to bruise it. They eat the midday meal earlier than they might in summer, because the light out here in winter is not a thing to be wasted, and a day that grows dark by 4 in the afternoon has already given away most of its usable hours before noon has properly finished. The stew is not yet fully ready, still hours from its best, but there is bread from the previous baking, and a wedge of hard cheese, and the last of a jar of pickled onions that Sarah put up back in September, and it is enough, more than enough, eaten at the small table pulled close to the fire, with all 4 of them crowded around it in a way that would feel cramped in summer, and feels, on a day like this, exactly right. Afterward, the afternoon settles into something slower. This is the part of a winter day that has no name really, no single task attached to it, just the long stretch of hours between the midday meal and whenever the light finally gives up and forces candles to be lit, and a household learns, over years, how to fill this stretch without it feeling either wasted or exhausting. Sarah takes up a basket of mending that has been accumulating for weeks, the way mending always accumulates faster than anyone intends. A torn hem here, a button missing there, one of William's shirts gone thin at the elbow in a way that wants patching before it becomes a hole. She works close to the window for what light is left, needle moving in small, practiced motions, and there is something almost meditative in watching her do it, the same steady rhythm as the bread earlier, a different task built from the same kind of patience. Grace has been given her own needle and a much simpler piece of work, a length of plain hemming that her mother checks periodically and unpicks, gently, without much comment, whenever the stitches wander too far from straight. This is how a girl learns, not through lecture, but through this quiet cycle of trying and being shown again and again, until one day the stitches simply start coming out right without anyone quite noticing the moment it happened. Ted has no sewing expected of him yet, and instead sits on the floor near the fire with a small collection of wooden toys that have been in the family longer than he has, a set of carved animals worn smooth at the edges from years of small hands, and he builds something out of them that seems to involve a complicated narrative he is narrating under his breath to nobody in particular. Outside, the snow has slowed to something closer to a light scatter now, drifting rather than falling in earnest, and what light there is has taken on that particular flat grey quality that comes with a fully overcast winter sky, a light with no real direction to it, no shadows worth speaking of, just a soft, even dimness that makes the hours feel longer and shorter at the same time. It is the kind of afternoon that asks for very little and gives in exchange something that is difficult to name but easy enough to recognize once you are sitting inside it. William, once the outdoor chores that daylight allows are finished, splitting a little extra kindling, checking the woodpile's cover against the returning snow, brings something in from the small shelf by the door that has sat there gathering dust since the previous winter, a slim, worn book, its spine cracked from handling, and settles into the chair nearest the fire with the particular satisfaction of a man who does not often get to sit down properly during daylight hours and intends to enjoy it while it lasts. He does not read to himself. That is not really the point of the book coming out at this hour. Instead, once Grace's hemming has been set aside and Ted's animals have finished whatever silent drama they were enacting, he reads aloud, a chapter or two, his voice low and unhurried, pausing now and then to answer some question Grace has about a word she does not know or some detail Ted once explained twice. It is not a grand book. Nobody in this family owns anything you would call a library. It is simply a story that has been read in this family before, that Grace has half memorized from previous winters and still wants to hear again anyway, the way children want familiar things repeated long after the surprise has worn off, because the comfort of knowing what happens next is its own kind of pleasure entirely separate from suspense. The light begins to go somewhere around 3 in the afternoon, not suddenly, but in that slow, grudging way winter light retreats, the grey outside the window deepening by degrees until Sarah, without needing to look at any clock, simply knows it is time and rises to fetch the candles down from their shelf. There are not many of them, and they are used carefully, one in the kitchen where the family will spend the evening, another kept ready by the stairs for whoever needs to go up first, because tallow and wax both cost money that a household like this one does not spend without thought. The candle light, once it is lit, does something to the room that the grey afternoon light never quite managed, pulling the walls in closer, making the space feel smaller and warmer and more private all at once, the fire's own light mixing with the candle's steadier glow to throw soft, moving shadows up across the low-beamed ceiling. Outside, full dark has come on, and with it the snow has picked up again. Visible now only as a faint ghostly movement past the edge of the curtain when someone glances that way, flakes catching what light escapes the window and then vanishing back into the blackness beyond it. The wind has risen slightly with evening, not fierce, but enough to find the small gaps around the door and the window frame and send an occasional cold thread of air across the floor, enough that Sarah has laid a rolled strip of old blanket along the bottom of the door, a small unglamorous defence against the draught that nonetheless makes a real difference by the time the fire has burned down toward midnight. Dinner, the stew that has been simmering all afternoon, is rich and thick by now, the barley swollen soft, the vegetables gone tender enough to fall apart at the touch of a spoon, and the family eats it slowly, without much conversation for the first few minutes, the particular focused quiet of people who have been cold and are now finally properly warm and properly fed at the same time. Afterward, Grace and Ted are allowed a little time before bed that belongs entirely to them, and this evening it becomes a simple game, with a set of dice worn smooth from years of handling, played on the hearthstone itself where the warmth is greatest. Ted losing badly and not minding nearly as much as he insists he does. Grace explaining rules that shift slightly in her favour each round, in a way her mother notices and chooses, tonight not to correct. William hums something under his breath while he works a little more on a wooden latch that has been sticking on the pantry door for a week now. Not quite a tune anyone could name, just the low, tuneless comfort sound of a man occupied with his hands in the warm, safe hours after a hard day's work is done. Later, once the latch is fixed and the dice game has run its course, Sarah takes down a small battered fiddle that belonged to her own father and plays a few simple tunes, nothing complicated, the same handful of melodies the family has heard 100 times before, and Grace hums along under her breath while Ted, worn out now from the day and the cold and the dice, has already begun to lean heavily against his mother's side. Bedtime, when it comes, follows its own quiet ritual, one that has been shaped as much by the cold as by the hour. The upstairs rooms hold no fire of their own, and so warmth has to be carried up in other forms, a stone or a wrapped brick heated near the hearth through the evening and tucked now beneath the blankets at the foot of each child's bed, enough residual heat in it to take the worst chill off the sheets by the time small feet climb in after it. Night clothes go on layered thicker than they would in any other season, a flannel gown over a shift, thick knitted stockings that will stay on through the night rather than be shed the way they might in July. Sarah tucks the blankets close around Ted's shoulders with the particular firmness of a mother who knows exactly how much cold air a poorly tucked blanket lets in overnight, and Grace, old enough now to manage her own tucking, but young enough still to want the goodnight kiss anyway, gets both. Downstairs, once the house has gone quiet above, William banks the fire for the night, arranging the coals and the last logs in the particular way that will keep a low, steady heat smouldering through the dark hours without burning through the family's whole supply before morning, a skill as practiced and precise, in its own way, as anything else done in this house across the length of a day. He and Sarah sit a little longer in the near dark, the fire's glow the only light left, not talking much, simply present together in the last quiet hour before their own bed, the kind of silence between two people who have shared enough winters together that words have become, for stretches like this one, almost unnecessary. Outside, the snow continues to fall, steady and unhurried, over the cottage and the stable and the lane and the fields beyond, over the frozen edges of the stream and the dark shapes of the hedgerows, over the whole small sleeping cluster of the village and the low hills that hold it, the first real snowfall of the season, settling deeper by the hour, into a landscape that will not fully see the ground again until spring finds its way back around. The days that follow blur into each other in the particular way winter days do out here, each one shaped by the same essential rhythm and yet never quite identical to the one before it. The snow that fell that first morning does not melt away, not really, not with any real conviction, and within a week it has been joined by more, layer settling over layer until the low stone wall around the garden disappears almost entirely beneath it, only the very top edge still visible, like a dark seam stitched across an otherwise unbroken quilt of white. The cold deepens too, in a way that has less to do with any single dramatic drop, and more to do with a slow accumulation, morning after morning, of frost that takes longer to burn off. Water that stays frozen later into the day before it thinks about softening again. William breaks the ice on the water trough each morning now, as a matter of routine rather than occasional necessity, and some mornings the skin that has formed overnight is thick enough that it takes real effort, the flat of an axe head rather than the flat of his hand, to open a drinking hole for the horse. Inside the cottage, the fire has become something closer to a constant presence than an occasional convenience, fed and watched and never quite allowed to die all the way down even during the brightest hours of the day, because a cottage this size loses its hard-won warmth astonishingly fast the moment the hearth is neglected, and starting entirely from cold ash is a slower, harder business than simply keeping a bed of coals alive and building back up from there. Sarah has grown expert, over these accumulating days, at reading the fire the way another woman might read weather, knowing by the colour and the sound of it roughly how long before it needs attention, knowing which of the wood in the stack burns hot and fast and which burns slow and steady, and is better saved for the deep hours of the night. There is a particular core that belongs entirely to William through these colder weeks, one that takes him out into the field beyond the garden most afternoons with an axe and a growing sense of urgency about the woodpile's height. Firewood is not simply gathered once and forgotten. It is a running account, drawn down every single day by every fire lit in every room, and a family that lets that account run too low too early in the season is a family facing a very cold February, and William knows this in his bones, the way any man who has spent his whole life managing a hearth knows it. So the afternoons, when the weather allows it, find him at the edge of the small woodland that borders their land, splitting logs that were felled and left to season the previous year, the sound of the axe carrying flat and sharp across the snow-muffled quiet, each log falling into two clean halves that go onto a growing sledge load destined for the stack by the back door. Grace, on the milder of these afternoons, is sometimes allowed out to help carry the smaller pieces, kindling and split ends too light for her father to bother sledging, back toward the house in a basket nearly as big as she is, her cheeks gone red with cold and effort, her breath coming in visible clouds that she has taken, this particular winter, to blowing out in deliberate long streams just to watch the shape of it, a small private amusement that costs nothing and delights her endlessly. Ted is not quite trusted with the axe's proximity yet, but he has his own version of usefulness, tasked with keeping the indoor kindling basket filled from the dry store, a job he performs with a seriousness disproportionate to its size, counting each piece aloud as he stacks it, as though the counting itself were half the point. The clothes kept for Sunday best receive a particular kind of care through these winter months, distinct from the household's everyday wool, brushed carefully and hung apart from the rest through the week. William's good coat and Sarah's better dress, both saved from the daily wear of fire tending and wood carrying that would otherwise dull and fray them far faster than a single day's wearing each week ever does. Grace has her own small good dress too, outgrown a little at the sleeve this particular winter, in a way Sarah has addressed with a careful let-down hem rather than any new purchase, and there is a certain solemnity every Sunday morning to the process of getting everyone properly turned out, hair brushed smoother than the weekday routine usually demands, boots given an extra wipe against the worst of the mud or slush that always seems to find them regardless of the care taken along the lane. There is a Sunday somewhere in the middle of all this that stands out a little from the days around it, not dramatically but noticeably, the way Sundays tend to in a household, still shaped by the rhythms of a village church. The whole family goes together, wrapped in every warm layer the house possesses, William leading the horse and cart carefully along a lane that has been packed down by enough traffic now to make the going a little easier than it was that first snowy morning, though still slow, still careful. The church itself is cold in the particular unforgiving way old stone buildings are always cold in winter, a cold that seems to live in the walls themselves rather than simply being the absence of a fire, and the congregation sits through the service in coats and shawls, breath visible in the air even indoors, a small brazier near the front doing more to comfort the eye than the body. But there is something in the gathering itself that has its own kind of warmth, entirely separate from temperature. Neighbours exchange news in low voices before the service begins, who has finished their wood stores, whose roof needs mending before it fails entirely under a heavy enough snow, whose cow calved early and unexpectedly in the cold snap. There is a particular comfort Sarah has always found in sitting shoulder to shoulder with people she has known her whole married life, in a building that has stood through more winters than any of them can count, singing hymns everyone half knows by heart, in voices that do not need to be beautiful to still feel like something worth doing together. Afterward, on the church steps, in the bright cold air with the sun making a rare appearance low and pale over the white fields, there is the usual slow exchange of goodbyes that takes longer than the walk to the cart itself would, Grace finding the girl she has decided is her very best friend this particular week, and the two of them disappearing briefly into some urgent, whispered conversation before being called back by their respective mothers, William exchanging a few last words with another farmer about the state of a shared boundary hedge that the snow has made temporarily impossible to properly assess. Let me tell you a little about the shape of this small village community, because I think it deserves more attention than the ordinary business of any single day tends to give it. There is a particular texture to village life in these coldest weeks that outsiders rarely think to imagine, a kind of quiet, practical solidarity that asks for no thanks and expects none. It shows itself in small ways more often than large ones. A neighbour passing along the lane on some errand of his own will stop, without being asked, to help free a cartwheel caught in a rut gone hard with ice. A basket of eggs, more than one household needs, finds its way 2 doors down to a family whose hens have gone quiet with the cold, delivered with some offhand remark about having too many and not wanting them to spoil, though everyone involved understands perfectly well what is actually happening and nobody comments on it. Mrs. Price, the widow William spoke with outside the shop that first snowy morning, receives, over the following weeks, an unremarked-upon loaf here, a portion of stew carried over in a covered dish there, small kindnesses arriving with just enough plausible excuse attached that no one's pride need be troubled by the plain fact of charity. Sarah pays Mrs. Price a proper visit herself, one grey afternoon in the middle of this stretch, ostensibly to return a borrowed dish, but really, both women understand without either saying so, to simply check on her, and finds the widow's own small cottage a little colder than her own, the fire banked lower than Sarah would ever allow her own hearth to burn, not from any lack of knowledge about how to tend it properly, but from the plainer, harder arithmetic of a household with only one modest income now supporting it, rather than 2. They sit together a while regardless, Sarah's own basket left, again with some offhand explanation about having baked too much that week, and there is a particular quality to Mrs. Price's gratitude, quiet and a little embarrassed and entirely genuine, that Sarah carries home with her afterward, a fresh reminder of exactly how much harder this same season she has weathered so steadily alongside William would be to face entirely alone. She mentions the visit to William that evening, once the children are occupied elsewhere, and the two of them settle, without much discussion needed, on a small standing arrangement for the remainder of the season, a portion set aside from whatever the household bakes or cooks in any given week, delivered quietly and regularly, rather than left to depend on Sarah remembering to think of it, a small formalized version of the same informal kindness the whole parish has already been extending in its own scattered way. Neither of them frames this as anything remarkable. It is simply, in a winter like this one, what is done. This is not sentiment exactly, or not only sentiment, it is also, quite simply, how a small community survives a hard season, each household's excess quietly covering some other household's shortfall, an economy of favours and small gifts that runs alongside the more formal economy of the market and the shop, invisible unless you know to look for it, and utterly essential to how everyone gets through to spring more or less intact. The candle that burns longest in these weeks, though, is the one lit not for any single evening's comfort, but for the long, slow work of preparing for what everyone in the village understands is coming, the deepest and hardest stretch of the winter still ahead, somewhere past the middle of the season, when the cold will settle in properly and the days will shrink to their shortest and even the most careful household finds itself tested. There is preserving still to finish, jars of fruit put up in the autumn checked now for any sign of spoilage before they are trusted to last the remaining months. A string of onions hung in the cool dark of the small pantry, apples wrapped individually in paper and laid out in a single careful layer so that none touches another and starts the whole lot rotting from one bad piece. Sarah spends one whole grey afternoon going through the pantry shelf by shelf with the particular thoroughness of a woman who understands that a mistake made now in the counting will not announce itself until some cold week in February, when there simply is not enough, and by then there will be very little to be done about it. She counts jars of preserved fruit and pickled vegetables, assesses the remaining flour against the weeks she expects it to need to last, checks the salted meat hanging in the cold store for any sign it has begun to turn. It is not glamorous work. Nobody will ever write a song about counting flour sacks by candlelight in a cold pantry. But it is the kind of work that stands quietly behind every warm meal this family will eat for the rest of the season, unseen and essential in exactly the way most of the real labour of keeping a household through winter tends to be. William takes stock of the woodpile around this same point in the season, walking its length with a critical eye and doing the same rough mental arithmetic he has done every year around this time, weeks already spent against weeks still likely remaining, and finds it, this particular year, holding up well enough that he allows himself, for the first time since the season began, to stop rationing his own daily cutting quite so carefully, a small private relief that shows itself mostly in how much more freely he lets the fire burn on the coldest evenings from this point onward. There is talk, as the days shorten further and the frost deepens, of Christmas approaching, and it arrives in the household the way it arrives in most households of modest means in this era, less through purchased things and more through small accumulated preparations that begin weeks in advance and build quietly toward the day itself. Sarah has been saving certain ingredients back for weeks now, dried fruit set aside a little at a time rather than used in the ordinary baking, a small hoard of spices bought carefully and used sparingly because they are dear and meant for this one occasion above all others. Grace and Ted have both, separately and with the elaborate secrecy children bring to such things, been working on small gifts of their own devising, Grace on a piece of embroidery she keeps hidden the moment either parent enters the room, Ted on something involving one of the smaller carved wooden animals that he has decided, through some 6-year-old logic that makes perfect sense to him and to no one else, needs to be given a new coat of whittled detail before it is fit to be a present. Gathering this greenery becomes its own small family outing, all 4 of them bundled out together one crisp afternoon to walk the hedgerow's length in search of the best holly, Grace and Ted competing good-naturedly over who can spot the branch with the most berries, William reaching the higher, better-laden branches that neither child could manage alone, and there is a particular unhurried pleasure to this small errand, no urgency in it beyond the pleasant kind, the whole family simply out together in the cold bright air, with a task just purposeful enough to give the walk its shape. The greenery comes in from the hedgerows and the edge of the small woodland a few days before the day itself, holly with its berries still bright red against the snow, a little ivy, brought inside and arranged along the mantel and the window ledge in the same simple, unfussy way the family has always done it. No great display, just enough to mark the room as belonging, for these particular days, to something a little different from the ordinary run of the season. There is a particular smell that comes with this, the cold green scent of the greenery itself mixing with wood smoke and, closer to the day, the rich smell of the special baking that Sarah undertakes only once a year, a heavier, darker cake studded with the saved dried fruit, mixed and left to sit and mellow for days before it is finally baked, filling the whole cottage with something warm and spiced that neither child can walk past without pausing to breathe it in. A pair of stockings, the plain ordinary knitted kind, rather than anything specially made for the purpose, gets hung that same evening along the edge of the mantel, a small custom neither Sarah nor William could trace back to any particular origin, but that has simply always been part of how this household marks the occasion. and Grace and Ted both check them with elaborate, unconvincing casualness several times through the evening, as though the stockings might somehow have filled themselves early, if only checked upon frequently enough. Let me pause here a moment before we step into Christmas Eve itself, because I think this particular evening deserves a little more care in the telling than the ordinary run of days around it. Christmas Eve settles over the cottage with a particular hush to it, different from the ordinary quiet of any other snowbound evening, though it would be hard to say exactly what makes the difference, since the fire is built the same way, and the candles are lit at the same hour, and the same low beams hold the same shadows overhead. Perhaps it is only that everyone in the house has been anticipating this particular evening for weeks now, in their own separate ways, and anticipation has a way of changing the texture of a room even when nothing visible has actually changed within it. William brings in extra wood that evening, more than the fire strictly needs, because there is a particular pleasure in a fire built generously on this one night of the year, rather than tended with the careful economy that governs most other evenings, and the flames climb higher and throw more light than usual across the low ceiling, catching on the dark green of the holly along the mantel, on the berries still impossibly red against it. Sarah has the cake out at last, the one that has been mellowing in its cloth wrapping for the better part of 2 weeks, and cuts it thin, because it is rich enough that thin slices are more than sufficient, and the whole family eats it slowly, savouring it in the particular way you savour something you have been waiting for, and know will not come again until next winter. There is a story that gets told on this particular evening every year, one that has nothing to do with any book on the shelf, a story that lives entirely in William's memory and gets shaped a little differently each time he tells it, about his own grandfather and a Christmas Eve deep in snow, not unlike this one, though whether the details have grown taller with each retelling, nobody in the family particularly minds finding out. Grace knows most of it by heart now, and mouths certain lines along with her father when he reaches them, and Ted, still young enough to find the whole thing genuinely thrilling, regardless of how many times he has heard it, sits pressed close against his mother's side, with his eyes wide in the firelight, utterly convinced, for the length of the telling, that every word of it is exactly as it happened. Bedtime comes later than usual that particular night, an indulgence granted without much argument, and when the children finally do climb the cold stairs to bed, warmed stones already tucked beneath their blankets as always, there is a particular kind of excited stillness to how they settle, the specific quiet of children trying very hard to fall asleep quickly because they understand, in whatever way children understand such logic, that morning will not properly arrive until they do. Christmas morning itself, when it comes, is not dramatically different in its shape from any other morning in this household. The fire still needs building up from the night's coals, water still needs fetching, the animals still need tending before anyone sits down to breakfast, because a cold morning does not pause its demands simply because the calendar has turned to a particular date, but there is, threaded through all of it, a lightness that was not there the week before. Grace humming something under her breath while she fills the kindling basket, Ted racing down the stairs faster than his mother would ordinarily allow on cold flagstones, both children glancing repeatedly toward the small collection of modest gifts that has appeared, overnight, on the mantel beneath the holly. The gifts themselves are small. By the standards of a later century they would look almost like nothing at all. A new pair of knitted mittens for each child, replacing ones that have gone thin at the fingertips, an orange each, a rare and genuine luxury this far from any port, purchased at real cost and saved specifically for this one morning, a small paper twist of sugared almonds to be shared between them. For William, a new pipe, saved for carefully across several months by Sarah without his noticing. For Sarah, a length of good ribbon and a small bottle of scent, chosen by William on that same shopping trip weeks earlier, tucked away and kept secret with a discipline that surprised even himself. Grace's embroidery, finally revealed, turns out to be a small, careful, slightly crooked rendering of the cottage itself, snow and all, and it is received with exactly the warmth and genuine delight that makes months of secretive after-bedtime stitching worthwhile. Ted's carved animal, its new whittled details visible mostly to Ted himself and requiring some patient interpretation from his parents, is accepted with equal solemnity. The rest of the day unfolds slowly, without much structure beyond the meal itself. A goose that has been fattening in the small yard for exactly this purpose since autumn, roasted through the afternoon and filling the cottage with a smell entirely different from the everyday one of bread and stew. There is a walk taken together in the early afternoon, all four of them wrapped against the cold, out along the lane and back, mostly for the simple pleasure of being outside together in the bright snow-brightened air, rather than for any particular purpose. Grace and Ted both throwing themselves briefly and enthusiastically into the deeper drifts along the hedge before their mother calls them back, before their mittens soak through entirely. By evening, full and warm and tired in the particular contented way that follows a day like this one, the family settles again by the fire, and William plays a little on the fiddle himself this time, badly, by his own cheerful admission, while Sarah laughs at him more than she sings along, and outside the snow has begun again, softly, as if the whole day had been granted a brief clear interlude specifically for the walk and the goose and the gifts, and now the season is simply resuming its steady, patient work. The days between Christmas and the New Year pass in a kind of soft, unhurried lull, the household's rhythms relaxing slightly from their usual discipline, without ever quite abandoning them, because a fire still needs tending, and a horse still needs feeding, regardless of what the calendar suggests about holidays. But there is less urgency to it, more time spent simply sitting together in the evenings, and by the time the year actually turns, the cold has settled into something Sarah has come, over her 11 winters in this house, to think of as the true winter, deeper and more serious than anything that came before it, the kind of cold that means every single task, however small, takes a little more effort and a little more thought than it did even a month earlier. Frost now forms indoors as well as out on the very coldest mornings, delicate feathered patterns creeping across the inside of the window glass overnight, and Grace has taken to tracing them with one careful finger before they melt under the room's gathering warmth, marvelling each time as though she has never seen the phenomenon before, though this is at minimum her 4th winter old enough to notice it properly. The water in the kitchen pail, left uncovered too near the outer wall one particularly hard night, is found in the morning with a thin skin of ice across its surface even indoors, and this becomes, for a week or two afterward, a small daily drama, Ted delighted each time by the crackling sound the ice makes when it is broken to get at the water beneath. Carrying water itself becomes a heavier undertaking than it was in the milder weeks. The well is a short walk from the back door, not far by any ordinary measure, but far enough, across ground gone treacherous with packed snow and ice, that Sarah has learnt to place her feet with real deliberation on the walk out and back, the pail's weight shifting and sloshing with every careful step, her free hand sometimes finding the low garden wall for balance where the path runs alongside it. William has chipped a rough path of sorts into the worst of the ice near the well's edge, enough grip scratched into the frozen ground with the flat of a hoe to make the footing marginally safer, a small unglamorous act of maintenance that nonetheless matters enormously to whoever is hauling water twice a day through the coldest stretch of the season. Clothes, when they are washed at all during these hardest weeks, present their own particular winter problem, because nothing dries quickly, or easily, or without becoming in the meantime a fixture of the kitchen that everyone must simply learn to live around. A line strung across one corner of the room near the fire holds whatever has been washed, shirts and stockings and small clothes hung close enough to the hearth to catch its warmth without catching an actual spark, and the whole family has grown accustomed to ducking around damp fabric on their way between the door and the fire, to the particular smell of wet wool drying slowly in a warm room, not unpleasant exactly, just present, one more small texture of the season that nobody outside a house like this one would ever think to imagine. There is a dog belonging to this household too, a rough-coated brown and white farm collie named Bess, old enough now that her muzzle has gone properly grey, but still sharp enough of ear and nose to earn her keep several times over across a hard winter like this one, and she has claimed, since the very first cold night of the season, a permanent spot on the flagstones nearest the hearth, close enough to the fire that Sarah has more than once had to nudge her gently further back with one stockinged foot before a stray spark could do any real harm to that thick favoured coat. Bess follows William out to the stable each morning without needing to be called, trots the whole muddy or frozen length of the lane beside the cart on every trip to the village, and has appointed herself, entirely without instruction, the primary early warning system against anything unfamiliar approaching the cottage, a low business-like bark her standard greeting for anyone or anything she has not personally cleared for entry. Ted, in particular, has grown across this winter into something close to Bess's shadow, the two of them inseparable through any stretch of the day that does not specifically require the dog elsewhere, and there are more evenings than either parent could easily count when bedtime has been delayed several minutes past its proper hour by Ted's insistence on one more round of a scrap-tossing game with Bess before he can possibly be expected to climb the stairs. She sleeps, most nights, curled at the foot of the stairs rather than up in either child's room. A boundary Sarah has held firm on since Bess was a much younger and considerably muddier dog, though on the very coldest nights of the whole season, the 2 or 3, when even the banked kitchen fire seemed barely equal to the task, William has been known to relax this particular rule and let her pad quietly upstairs to lie, just for the night, across the foot of Ted's bed, where her considerable warmth does more good than any warming pan could manage alone. There is a visit, sometime through the milder middle stretch of the season, from a travelling peddler making his slow, careful winter circuit of the scattered parish households, his cart loaded with the kind of small useful goods that do not always make the trip out from the village shop on their own. Ribbon and buttons and needles, a length of good lace that Sarah examines with real interest before deciding, with only a small pang of regret, that it is dearer than the household's current accounts can comfortably justify. He carries news too, gathered up from every household along his slow winter route, who has had a difficult lambing further up the valley, whose roof came through the last hard storm rather worse than hoped, and the family gathers at the door for a few minutes in the cold to hear whatever of this scattered news he has to share. Grace and Ted both fascinated by the sheer breadth of places this one man seems to have recently passed through, a whole winter's worth of the wider parish's business carried from door to door in the back of a single loaded cart. The horse feels the deepening cold as much as anyone, and William's care of the animal grows correspondingly more attentive through these weeks. An extra blanket added over its back at night, the stable's small gaps stuffed with straw against draughts that would have been tolerable enough in November, and are simply too much to risk now. Hooves checked daily for the kind of packed ice that can cause real lameness if left unaddressed. There is a morning, deep in this coldest stretch, when the water trough is frozen solid enough that William's usual method of breaking it fails entirely, the ice too thick, and he has to carry warmed water out from the kitchen kettle instead, 2 full trips across the frozen yard in the grey dawn light, before the horse has anything at all to drink. A small extra labour added quietly to an already full morning, absorbed without complaint, because that is simply what the season asks of a household that keeps an animal through it. Travel along the lane, difficult even at the start of the season, has become something approaching genuinely risky by these deepest weeks, and William makes the trip to the village less often now, spacing his errands out and combining several needs into a single careful journey, rather than making the trip lightly, aware in a way that requires no real deliberation, only the settled instinct of a man who has lived through enough winters here already that a cart overturned or a horse injured on a bad stretch of icy lane in this cold could turn a minor inconvenience into something genuinely dangerous with unsettling speed. The household has planned for this, has stocked carefully through the autumn and the early weeks of winter with exactly this kind of stretch in mind, and there is a quiet satisfaction when Sarah counts the pantry shelves again in the first week of the new year, in finding that the earlier careful counting has held that there is enough, comfortably enough, to see them through whatever the rest of the season still intends to bring. The cottage itself carries, by this point in the season, a particular layered smell that has built up gradually across the accumulated weeks, wood smoke settled deep into every fabric and beam, the faint sweetness of drying wool, a lingering trace of whatever was last baked or simmered, all of it mixed together into something Sarah could not properly describe to a stranger, but would recognize instantly, blindfolded, as simply the smell of her own home in winter, distinct from how the same rooms smell in the milder months, distinct too, she suspects without ever having occasion to test it, from how any other family's household smells, after its own particular accumulated season of fires and cooking and closely lived togetherness, there is a particular quality to the evenings during this stretch of the deepest winter that Sarah has come, over the years, to treasure more than she would ever admit outright. A stillness that settles over the cottage once the children are fed and the fire is built up and there is, for an hour or two before bed, genuinely nothing more urgent to be done than sitting close to the warmth with something in her hands. Knitting fills most of these hours now, more than sewing, because the household's need for warm things never quite lets up through a season like this one. Stockings wearing through at the heel faster than anyone would like, mittens lost or outgrown, a scarf begun back in November, still not finished because something more urgent kept interrupting it. The needles click together in a rhythm so practiced Sarah barely needs to watch her own hands anymore. And she has taught Grace the basics of it this winter, a simple garter stitch that produces, so far, a slightly uneven and much-loved scrap of fabric that Grace insists, with the fierce pride of a beginner, will eventually become a scarf for her father, though at the current rate of progress it seems more likely to remain a small, cherished, permanently unfinished square. There is something in this particular evening task that suits the season perfectly, repetitive enough to require little conscious thought, productive enough to feel worthwhile, and quiet enough to leave room for exactly the kind of low, meandering conversation that fills these hours, about nothing important, about everything, about a neighbour's new calf, and whether the frost will hold through the week, and whether Grace's best friend of the month is still in fact her best friend, a status that seems to shift with some regularity. William, on these same evenings, often has some small repair in hand, a harness buckle that wants mending, a chair leg that has worked loose, the endless small maintenance that any household this size generates and that somebody has to see to eventually, and he works at it methodically in the firelight, glancing up now and then to add some comment to whatever conversation is drifting around him, or simply to watch his family in the particular golden hush of candlelight and firelight mixed together, an image he could not have put into words if asked, but one he holds on to, quietly, as one of the genuine pleasures of a life that does not offer many extravagant ones. Ted, too young yet for knitting, and past the point of being satisfied by his wooden animals every single evening, has taken up a habit this winter of asking, most nights, for the names of the stars, on the rare clear evenings when his father takes him out briefly before bed to look up at a sky gone startlingly bright and close in the absence of any moon-competing light beyond their own small windows. William knows a handful of names, passed down from his own father in turn, not many, but enough to satisfy a 6-year-old's curiosity for a few minutes at a stretch, and there is something in these brief cold excursions, father and son standing together in the frozen yard, with their breath clouding upward into a sky scattered impossibly thick with stars, that neither of them would think to call significant, and that both of them, in their separate ways, will likely remember for the rest of their lives. There are signs, in the day or two before any real storm, that a household long practiced in reading this particular landscape learns to notice without ever needing anything so formal as an instrument to confirm them, a particular heaviness to the grey sky pressing low over the fields, the animals grown restless and hard to settle, a stillness in the air that feels, if you have lived through enough winters to recognise it, distinctly different from the ordinary stillness of an unremarkable cold day. William notices this particular quality building through the afternoon before the season's worst storm arrives, mentions it to Sarah in passing while he brings in extra wood, more than the evening strictly requires, and makes one final check of the stable's shelter and the animals' feed before full dark falls, small precautions taken on nothing more definite than long-practiced instinct, precautions that will matter a great deal by the time the wind rises properly after midnight. There comes, sometime in the deepest stretch of January, a storm that outdoes everything the season has offered before it, not merely snow falling steadily, but snow driven sideways on a wind that finds every gap in the old cottage's construction and makes its presence known, rattling the shutters, sending a low constant moan around the chimney that keeps Grace awake longer than usual, curled close against her mother's side in the big bed, rather than braving her own cold room upstairs on this particular night. The fire is built as high as William dares that evening, and still the cold presses in at the edges of the room in a way it has not managed to do on any calmer night this winter, and there is a tension to the household through those hours that has nothing dramatic in it, nothing spoken aloud, just the quiet, private awareness every adult in a house like this one carries through a storm like this one, that the roof and the walls and the careful stores in the pantry are, tonight, being properly tested. By morning, the storm has blown itself out, leaving behind a landscape transformed yet again. Drifts piled against the north side of the cottage taller than Ted himself, the lane entirely erased beneath an unbroken sweep of white, and the whole family steps outside together into a silence so complete and so total that it feels, for a moment, like standing inside some vast held breath. William spends the better part of that day simply digging a path from the door to the stable, another to the woodpile, another, eventually, out to where the lane resumes some visible shape, and Grace and Ted, once the most urgent digging is done, are finally allowed the kind of unstructured play in genuinely deep snow that they have been half hoping for since the season's very first flakes, building something that starts out ambitiously as a fort and ends, an hour later, as a lumpy but much-loved snow figure standing sentry near the garden wall, one of Sarah's old scarves wrapped around its neck and a scrap of coal for each eye. The digging out itself, in the days following that great storm, becomes something close to a shared parish undertaking, every household along the lane emerging within a day or two to clear its own stretch, and there develops, without any formal coordination at all, a rough understanding that neighbours will work outward from their own doors until the cleared paths eventually meet somewhere in the middle, a small practical cooperation that gets the whole lane passable again days sooner than any single household working alone could have managed. William spends a good part of 2 full mornings on this, his own stretch cleared first and then a length beyond it, meeting eventually with a neighbour working the opposite direction, the 2 men exchanging the same weary, satisfied nod that seems to pass between everyone in the parish this particular week, the wordless acknowledgement of a hard shared task properly finished. There is a visit that comes a few days after the storm, once the lane has been beaten back into some kind of passable order by the boots and cartwheels of everyone in the village digging their own way free, and it takes the shape of an afternoon spent with a neighbouring family, the Hargroves, who live perhaps a mile off along a lane that intersects with the Whitlocks' own somewhere past the second bend. This is not an elaborate social occasion, nothing that would be called a party by any later century's standard, simply Sarah and the children walking over one grey afternoon while William attends to some shared business with Mr. Hargrove concerning a boundary hedge, and the women settling by the Hargrove hearth with their own mending in hand while the children disappear into whatever game 2 households worth of youngsters can invent together on short notice. William and Mr. Hargrove, meanwhile, conduct their own version of this same unhurried visiting out by the boundary hedge itself, examining a stretch of it that has grown ragged and gapped over the past year, discussing between them the best time to lay it properly once the ground softens, trading in the process a good deal of practical opinion about hedge-laying technique that neither man particularly needs to hear from the other, but that both seem to genuinely enjoy exchanging regardless, the way men of this particular temperament often enjoy discussing work they already know perfectly well how to do. Tea is offered, weak but hot, and there is a particular pleasure in this kind of visiting that has nothing to do with novelty, since Sarah has known Mrs. Hargrove for the better part of a decade and could likely predict most of what will be discussed before a single word is spoken, and everything to do with the simple comfort of company outside her own 4 walls, a change of hearth and chair and view that, in a season this confining, matters more than it might seem to from the outside. The 2 women talk of ordinary things, the state of everyone's pantry stores this deep into the season, a piece of news about a cousin in the next parish, a shared low-voiced concern about Mrs. Price's continuing thinness that neither of them quite knows how to address beyond the small kindnesses already being extended. Grace and the eldest Hargrove girl, roughly her own age, have long since worked out between them a favourite winter game that involves nothing more elaborate than a set of smooth pebbles and an elaborate, ever-shifting set of rules that seem to exist mainly in their own 2 heads, and Ted trails after the younger Hargrove boy with the particular devoted shadow following that a 6-year-old reserves for any slightly older child willing to tolerate him. The afternoon passes this way, unremarkably, pleasantly, and by the time Sarah gathers the children for the walk home, the light has already begun its early winter retreat, the sky gone that flat pewter grey that precedes dusk by an hour or more at this time of year, and they make their way back along the lane, with William meeting them part way, having finished his own business with Mr. Hargrove some while earlier, and come to walk the last stretch with his family, rather than let them make it alone in the gathering dark. The stream, when they cross the small footbridge near the lane's second bend on this particular walk home, has finally frozen solid enough, William judges, testing it cautiously with one boot before allowing either child near the bank to bear a careful, brief venture onto its surface, and Grace and Ted both take turns sliding a short distance across the ice with the barely restrained shrieking delight of children who have been waiting the entire season for exactly this permission, their boots skidding and their arms windmilling for balance, while their parents watch from the bank with the particular mixture of indulgence and vigilance that governs most childhood risks judged, on balance, worth allowing. Birds have grown bold around a cottage through these hardest weeks, driven by hunger to a boldness they would never show in a milder season, and a small scattering of crumbs put out deliberately near the kitchen window each morning draws a cluster of them close enough that Ted can watch, nose nearly pressed against the cold glass, as they dart in and snatch what they can, before retreating to the safety of the bare hedge. There are other tracks too, noticed occasionally in the fresh snow of a morning, the neat double line of a fox's passage along the edge of the garden wall, investigated with great seriousness by both children and explained by William with the kind of quiet, practical woodcraft knowledge that has been handed down through generations of people who need to know, without much fuss, which animals are moving through their land and why. Evenings continue in their established rhythm, knitting and mending and the low fire-lit conversation that has become, by this point in the season, as natural and unremarked upon as breathing, though there is, as January wears on toward its end, a subtle shift beginning to make itself felt, so gradual that it would be easy to miss entirely if you are not paying the particular close attention that a household confined largely indoors for months tends to develop. The light, Sarah notices one afternoon while hanging washed clothes near the fire, has begun lasting a few minutes longer than it did at the season's darkest point. Not enough yet to change anything about how the days are structured, but enough, if you know to look for it, to register as a small and genuine promise, the first faint suggestion that the wheel of the year has quietly begun turning back towards spring, even as the cold itself shows no immediate sign of loosening its grip. I want to tell you about the coldest stretch of this whole long season now, because I think it deserves to be understood properly rather than simply mentioned in passing. February arrives without any real ceremony, simply the calendar turning while the cold holds steady, and if anything this middle stretch of the month brings some of the hardest weather the whole season has offered yet. A stretch of clear, bitter days where the sky goes a pale, hard blue overhead and the temperature drops lower after dark than it has at any point since the first snow fell. Cold enough that the inside of the water pail freezes solid most nights despite every precaution. Cold enough that William brings the more delicate stores, a crock of butter, a jar of dripping, right into the kitchen itself rather than trusting them to the pantry's usual cool. This is the kind of cold that changes the sound of the world outside, snow gone hard and dry underfoot, so that every step produces a sharp, distinct crunch, rather than the softer give of wetter snow, and Grace, walking to fetch something from the woodpile one particularly bitter morning, stops halfway across the yard simply to listen to her own footsteps, the strange squeaking crunch of it, a sound the season had not offered before in quite this way. Smoke from the chimney, on mornings like these, rises dead straight in the still, frozen air, a single unwavering grey column climbing into a sky with no wind at all to bend it, and there is something almost unsettling in the stillness of a landscape this cold, a hush that goes beyond the ordinary quiet of a snowbound morning into something closer to suspension, as if the whole world has simply paused, waiting out the worst of it before daring to move again. Wool becomes, through these hardest days, something closer to a household obsession than a mere article of clothing, and Sarah finds herself layering everyone thicker than she has all season, a second pair of stockings pulled on beneath the first, an extra shawl kept permanently draped over the back of the chair nearest the fire for whoever needs it most in a given hour. There is a particular knowledge, built up over years and passed down through generations of women managing households exactly like this one, about which wools serve which purposes best: the coarse, hard-wearing stuff for outer garments that need to shed weather, the softer, finer-spun wool, when it can be afforded, kept close against the skin where its scratch matters more and its warmth is worth the extra cost. William's coat, that same coat that has done 12 winters now, gets a careful examination on one of these coldest evenings, Sarah checking the lining by candlelight for any thin patch that wants reinforcing before it fails entirely on some bitter morning when failure would matter most. The candles themselves, through these darkest, longest evenings, have become almost a character in their own right within the household's daily rhythm, each one watched and rationed with a kind of casual precision that comes from years of practice. Tallow candles for the ordinary evenings when a steady, unremarkable light is all that is needed. The better beeswax ones, fewer in number and saved carefully, brought out only for occasions that seem to warrant something a little finer, a habit Sarah maintains less out of any real necessity and more, she would admit if pressed, because marking certain evenings as different from the ordinary run of them matters to her in a way she has never quite examined closely. There is a whole small collection of sayings and rhymes about the weather that has passed down through William's family across generations, half-remembered fragments about ring around a winter moon meaning rain or snow within the day, about the particular way smoke behaves in a chimney signalling a change in the wind before any other sign confirms it, and he offers these up to the children periodically, not with any real scientific confidence, but with the easy, affectionate half-belief of a man repeating something his own father repeated to him, aware that some of it is likely nothing more than old coincidence dressed up as wisdom and unwilling, all the same, to let any of it go entirely unspoken. Grace has begun collecting these small sayings herself this particular winter, testing each one against the actual weather that follows with the serious, methodical attention of a much older scholar, and reports back to her father, with evident satisfaction whenever one of them proves true, an outcome that happens, by her own admittedly unscientific count, rather more often than not. There is a particular pleasure William takes, on the coldest and stillest of these February evenings, in stepping just outside the door before bed, not for any practical purpose, simply to stand a moment in the frozen, silent dark and look up at a sky gone impossibly clear and thick with stars, the kind of sky that a warmer, hazier season never quite manages to offer, and more than once Grace or Ted has been coaxed out to join him for a few minutes, wrapped hastily in whatever blanket is nearest, 3 shapes standing together in the black cold yard, with their breath rising in visible clouds, looking up at something vast and silent and, in its own way, deeply comforting precisely because it asks nothing of them at all. Inside, the cottage itself seems to have grown around the family through these months, in a way that feels, by this point in the season, almost like a living thing, rather than simple stone and thatch and timber. Every creak of the floorboards has become familiar enough to be identified without looking. Which step announces someone coming down from the bedroom? Which particular groan of the door means the wind has shifted rather than that someone has actually opened it? The low beam over the kitchen doorway that Sarah still, 11 winters into her marriage, occasionally forgets to duck for, has left its mark more than once, and William has taken, with the dry humour of a long marriage, to reminding her of each instance, with more affection than the actual annoyance warrants. The particular way the firelight moves across the whitewashed wall above the mantel each evening, shifting and settling as the logs burn down, has become something Sarah could likely describe from memory even with her eyes closed. So many hours has she spent, across so many winters now, sitting exactly where she sits most evenings, watching exactly that patch of wall catch and lose the fire's shifting glow. There is a particular ritual to the very first minutes of any cold morning in this household, repeated with only the smallest variation across the whole length of the season, that begins before anyone has properly opened their eyes, a reluctance to leave the warmth of blankets that every single member of the family shares equally regardless of age, followed by the specific familiar shock of bare feet meeting a floor gone properly cold overnight, followed by the scramble, universal and unremarked upon, toward whatever clothing sits nearest and warmest. William is always first up regardless, some deep habitual clock in him that has never once, across 11 winters of marriage, allowed him to sleep past the hour the fire wants rebuilding, and Sarah wakes most mornings to the sound of him already below, the scrape of the poker against cold ash, the particular soft crackle of new kindling catching, sounds so utterly familiar by this point in the season that she could likely identify the exact stage of the fire's rebuilding without ever opening her eyes at all. There is a task that belongs to these deep February days that has nothing to do with the cold directly and everything to do with a household's quiet, forward-looking practicality, which is the mending and preparing of tools and equipment that will not be needed again until spring, but that must be ready, without fail, the moment spring actually arrives. William spends several of these bitter, indoor-bound afternoons at this work, seated near enough to the fire to keep his hands from stiffening, going through the harness leather piece by piece, checking every strap and buckle for the kind of wear that would only reveal itself as a genuine problem at the worst possible moment, out in a field somewhere, with planting already underway and no time to spare for a broken strap. A hoe blade gets sharpened, a cracked handle on an old spade gets replaced with a length of ashwood seasoned specifically for this purpose the previous year. None of it is urgent in the way the fire or the water or the animals are urgent day to day, but all of it matters in the slower, longer accounting that a household like this one has learnt, across generations, to keep. There is an evening, once the children have gone up to bed, when William and Sarah sit together over the small household account book kept in a drawer near the hearth, going through the winter's spending so far against what remains of the year's savings, with the same careful, unhurried attention they bring to nearly everything else this season asks of them. The numbers are not generous, they never really are, but they are, this particular winter, holding steady, the earlier autumn's careful preparation having done exactly what it was meant to do, and there is a quiet satisfaction in this shared accounting that neither of them would call pleasure exactly, but something adjacent to it, the specific comfort of two people facing a hard season's true costs together and finding so far that the costs have been met. William mentions, turning the page, that the coat's mended lining ought to see them through another winter yet before any real replacement becomes necessary, and Sarah notes in turn that the wool set aside for spring's fresh knitting will want supplementing a little once the next shearing comes in, small practical exchanges that carry, beneath their plain surface, the whole quiet partnership of a marriage built as much on this kind of shared, careful stewardship as on any warmer sentiment. Though the warmer sentiment is there too, plainly, in how easily they fall into this particular evening task together, shoulder to shoulder over a single shared candle. There is a walk taken one late afternoon, when the day's chores have wrapped up a little earlier than usual, and the sky has cleared into something briefly, startlingly beautiful, the whole family setting out together along the lane, simply to be outside in it before the light goes entirely. The sun, low and orange and considerably softer than its summer self, sinks slowly behind the bare black lattice of the far hedgerow, throwing long blue shadows across the snow that stretch and merge and finally dissolve into the general dusk as the colour drains from the sky overhead, deep gold fading through rose to a clear cold lavender that Sarah finds herself stopping to properly look at, one hand resting on Grace's shoulder, both of them briefly still amid the ordinary business of the walk. Ted, less inclined towards stillness even in the face of genuine beauty, is more occupied with the particular crunch of fresh snow underfoot and the challenge of stepping only in places nobody has yet walked. But even he pauses, briefly, caught by the sight of the first faint star appearing directly above the darkening line of the hedge, and points it out to his father with the same solemn pride he brings to any genuine discovery. Sarah's own version of this same forward-looking work involves the linen chest, gone through methodically over the course of an afternoon while the children are occupied elsewhere, every sheet and shirt and small cloth examined for wear, mended where mending will serve, set aside for eventual replacement where it will not, because spring brings its own demands, and a household caught unprepared in April pays for it just as surely as one caught unprepared in January, only in different currency. There is a particular satisfaction in this kind of methodical stock-taking that Sarah has come to genuinely enjoy over the years, a sense of the household's whole shape and health laid out plainly before her, problems caught early rather than allowed to compound, a feeling of being, in some small but real way, ahead of the season rather than simply reacting to it. On evenings when neither child is otherwise occupied, they have taken up a simple game with the candlelight itself, hands held close to the flame and angled just so against the wall to throw a shifting shadow shaped, with enough imagination, like a rabbit or a bird, or, in Ted's more ambitious and considerably less convincing attempts, something he insists is a dragon. Grace has grown genuinely skilled at this particular small art, her shadow rabbit's ears twitching with real, deliberate motion that draws appreciative laughter from both parents most times she performs it, and there is something in this simple, entirely free amusement, requiring nothing beyond hands and firelight and a blank stretch of wall, that captures, in its own small way, the particular resourceful, uncomplicated pleasure this whole household has learnt to find in a season that offers so little in the way of purchased entertainment, and so much, instead, in the way of invented, homemade delight. The children, confined more thoroughly indoors during this stretch of particularly hard weather than at almost any other point in the season, have developed their own repertoire of indoor amusements that stretch the small cottage's limited space in ways that would surprise anyone who has not spent a long winter cooped up with young imaginations. A length of string becomes, in Grace's hands, an elaborate cat's cradle passed back and forth with a patience that would astonish anyone who has only seen her fidget through church. The set of carved wooden animals that occupied Ted so thoroughly back in the season's first days has by this point been assigned an entire complex mythology of relationships and rivalries that he narrates under his breath with the seriousness of a man managing real affairs of state. On one particularly housebound afternoon, the two of them construct, out of a discarded wooden crate and several strategically draped old blankets, a structure they insist is a proper fortress, and defend it against invaders that exist entirely in their own shared imagination for the better part of 2 hours. A length of sustained cooperative play that leaves both parents grateful and faintly amazed in equal measure. Storytelling fills a great many of these deep winter evenings beyond the one grand Christmas Eve telling, smaller stories, family stories, the kind that get passed down not because they are written anywhere, but because someone keeps telling them, and on one particular evening it is Sarah's turn, a story about her own mother, gone some years now, and a winter early in her own childhood, when the snow came so deep that the whole village was cut off from the wider world for the better part of a week, and how her mother had managed, through some combination of resourcefulness and sheer stubbornness, to keep everyone fed and warm, and more than that, genuinely cheerful through the whole ordeal. Grace listens to this one with a particular quality of attention different from the Christmas Eve story, something more searching in it, and asks, when it is finished, whether her own mother could do the same thing if it came to that, and Sarah, without hesitation, tells her yes, of course, and means it completely, though she does not say aloud the small private hope underneath the answer that it will not, this year, actually come to that. There is, threaded through all of these quiet indoor weeks, a particular private pleasure Sarah takes in certain small solitary moments that belong entirely to her, brief windows in an otherwise fully occupied day, a few minutes after the children are settled and before William comes in from the last of the evening's outdoor chores, when the kitchen is quiet and the fire is hers alone to watch. She does not do much with these minutes, usually. Sometimes she simply sits. Sometimes she works a few more rows of whatever knitting is currently in hand. But there is something in the sheer, uninterrupted stillness of it, 5 minutes, 10 at most, that she has come, across 11 winters of managing this particular household through this particular season, to treasure more than almost anything else the day offers. A small private pocket of quiet carved out of a life that otherwise belongs, almost entirely and almost always, to everyone but herself. Food through these winter months follows its own quiet variation, shaped entirely by what was put by in the autumn, and by the small careful economy of stretching it properly across the season's full length, and there is a particular skill in this that Sarah has honed across her years running this kitchen, knowing exactly how to make a single joint of salted meat serve 3 or 4 separate meals in 3 or 4 separate forms, before it is finally used up entirely. A Sunday might see it roasted, simply, with whatever root vegetables the cellar still offers. What remains gets worked, a day or two later, into a hash with the last of the potatoes, and whatever is left after that goes into the stock pot, simmered down slowly to flavour a soup that stretches the final scraps into something that still, somehow, tastes like a proper meal rather than an afterthought. Bread remains the household's steady backbone through it all, baked in batches large enough to last several days at a stretch, the baking day itself a small production requiring the fire built up hot and even in a particular way that differs from its ordinary evening tending, and Sarah has grown so practiced at judging the oven's readiness by nothing more than the colour of the coals and the quality of heat against the back of her outstretched hand that she rarely bothers any more with any more formal method of testing it. There is something deeply satisfying, on a baking day, in the particular warm yeasty smell that fills the whole small cottage for hours afterward, clinging faintly to the walls and the low beams in a way that seems to linger just at the edge of noticing for a day or two after the actual loaves have cooled. Porridge, thick and plain, makes its regular appearance at breakfast through the coldest weeks, a food with nothing glamorous about it, but everything practical, cheap and filling, and quick enough to prepare that it can be ready before anyone has properly finished dressing against the morning cold, sweetened on the better mornings with a spoonful of the honey William trades for, occasionally with a neighbour who keeps bees, though the hives themselves sit dormant and silent now, waiting out the cold, same as everyone else. Preserved fruit, put up in the autumn's abundance, appears in small careful portions rather than lavish ones, stretched to make it last, a spoonful here over the porridge, a few pieces there, worked into a simple pudding on some evening that feels, for whatever small reason, like it warrants a little extra. The hearth itself, that great constant presence at the centre of the household's whole existence through these months, requires its own ongoing attention beyond the simple daily feeding of it. William checks the chimney periodically for the build-up that any regularly used hearth accumulates over a season of steady burning, aware, in the quiet practical way of a man who has heard the occasional story of a chimney fire in some unlucky neighbouring household, that neglecting this particular maintenance carries a risk far worse than mere inconvenience. The choice of wood itself matters more than an outsider might guess. The harder woods, oak and ash, saved and burned in the deepest cold because they give a longer, steadier heat. The softer, quicker burning woods used more freely in milder stretches, or kept for the fast hot fire needed to get bread baking properly. This is knowledge that lives, in this household as in most others like it, almost entirely in practice rather than in any book, passed from William's own father to him the same unhurried way most practical knowledge moves through a family like this one, by watching, by doing, by getting it wrong occasionally in ways gentle enough to learn from. Laundry, when a full washing day comes around, transforms the small kitchen for the better part of a day into something closer to a steam-filled workshop than a domestic space, a large tub set near the fire and filled with water heated in careful stages, because heating enough water for a proper wash by the kettle alone would take the better part of the morning on its own. Sarah works at it with her sleeves pushed back and her forearms reddened from the hot water and the vigorous scrubbing that heavily soiled winter clothes demand, and Grace, old enough now to be genuinely useful rather than merely underfoot, helps with the wringing, the two of them working a shirt or a sheet between them, twisting in opposite directions to force out as much water as possible before it goes up onto the line strung across the kitchen's warmest corner, where it will hang, dripping slowly at first and then merely damp, for the better part of 2 days before it is properly dry enough to be put away. On one such washing day, deep in the season, Grace pauses in the middle of the wringing to ask her mother, with the sudden unfiltered directness of a 9-year-old's curiosity, whether Sarah ever gets tired of it, all of it, the fire and the water and the endless small tasks that seem to fill every single day without exception, and Sarah considers the question seriously before answering, because it deserves a serious answer rather than a dismissive one. She admits honestly that yes, some days she does, that there are mornings when the thought of yet another fire to build and yet another meal to plan feels genuinely heavy, but she tells Grace too that there is something in the doing of it, in watching a cold room turn warm because of her own hands, in watching her own children fed and clothed and comfortable through a hard season because of work she chose and knows how to do well, that outweighs the tiredness more often than not, and Grace considers this answer with unusual gravity for a girl who was, moments earlier, mostly focused on not dropping the wet sheet. Mittens and gloves take a particular beating across a season like this one, small hands pulling at the wool through daily wear until a thumb pokes through or a seam gives way at the palm, and Sarah keeps a running mental account of whose pair wants attention this week, mending them by firelight with the same quick, practiced needlework she brings to everything else in the household's endless small repair. Ted in particular seems to possess some unusual talent for wearing through the tips of his mittens faster than any child reasonably should, a fact his mother remarks on with fond, familiar exasperation nearly every fortnight, though she has never once actually refused the mending itself, only the occasional theatrical sigh that accompanies picking the small garment back up from wherever it has been abandoned by the hearth. There is an evening when Ted, watching the fire with the particular unfocused attention of a child on the edge of sleep, asks his father, out of nowhere, why winter happens at all, why the whole world should turn cold and dark this way every single year, rather than simply staying pleasant, and William considers the question with more seriousness than its sleepy offhand delivery might have warranted, offering in the end the same simple explanation his own father once offered him, something about the sun sitting lower and paler in the sky through these months, less strength in its light to warm the ground properly, and about how the cold, however hard it feels while you are living through it, always eventually gives way again to the sun climbing higher and stronger, the way it has every single year within living memory, and William assures him with the easy, unshaken confidence of a man who has simply never had reason to doubt it, every year long before that too. Ted considers this explanation with the particular grave attention he brings to most things told to him by his father, and asks after a moment whether the sun ever simply forgets to climb back up again, and William tells him, without hesitation, that it has not happened yet in the whole history of the world, and he sees no particular reason to expect it might choose this particular year to start, an answer that satisfies Ted completely, and he drifts the rest of the way into sleep against his father's shoulder a few minutes later, entirely reassured on a point he had not, until that evening, realized was troubling him at all. There is a particular corner of the evening most nights given over to Grace's letters, a small slate and a stub of chalk brought out after supper, while there is still enough energy left in her for the concentration it requires, and William oversees this most evenings, patient in a way that surprises him a little every time he notices it in himself, since patience was never a trait he would have claimed for himself before children arrived to require it of him. Grace forms her letters carefully, tongue caught between her teeth in concentration, sounding out words under her breath the way the village schoolmaster has taught her on the 2 mornings a week that schooling is available to children of the parish, weather permitting, which through the hardest stretch of this particular winter has meant considerably less schooling than usual, the lane too treacherous too often for the walk to be safely made. There is a morning, after nearly a fortnight of the lane too treacherous for the walk, when the schoolmaster sends word that the small parish schoolhouse will open again, and Grace sets off that day with a lightness in her step that has nothing to do with the cold, walking alongside 2 other children from further up the lane who have gathered to make the journey together the way parish children always have, bundled thick against the weather, their combined breath rising in a small shared cloud above them as they go. The schoolhouse itself, a single low room, warmed by its own modest hearth at one end, holds perhaps a dozen children on a good winter attendance day, fewer on the harder ones, and the schoolmaster, a patient, weathered man who has taught in this same room for longer than Sarah herself has been alive, works his way around slates and letters and simple sums with the unhurried thoroughness of someone who understands perfectly well that a hard winter interrupts this work regularly and has long since stopped expecting anything else. Grace comes home from this first reopened school day full of news, a new word learned, a small dispute settled among the other girls over whose turn it was to sit nearest the hearth, and reports all of it to her mother in a rush while she is still unwinding her outer layers by the door, and Sarah listens to every word of it with genuine attention, because she understands, better than Grace herself yet can, how much a hard winter's interruptions to something as small and ordinary as a school day can matter to a child eager for exactly this kind of regular structure and company beyond her own four walls. Icicles have become this particular winter one of Ted's most reliable sources of fascination, forming in long glittering rows along the cottage's low eaves wherever a little daytime melt drips and then refreezes overnight, and he has taken to breaking the smaller, more reachable ones free with careful, delighted concentration, holding them up to the pale winter light to watch it refract through them, sucking on the ends the way children have likely done, in exactly this fashion for as long as there have been icicles and children both, despite his mother's mild, regularly repeated, and largely ignored objections about the wisdom of eating ice straight off a roof that also happens to shelter a flock of hens. There is a particular satisfaction Ted takes, some mornings, in simply counting the icicles along the front of the house, reporting the total to whoever will listen with the solemn precision of a boy convinced that this number carries real significance, and though it never does, not really. The counting itself has become one more small, treasured ritual belonging entirely to this one long winter. This gap gets filled, in its own small way, by these fireside evenings, William working through her slate with her, Sarah occasionally correcting a word from across the room without looking up from her own knitting, and there is a particular pride Grace takes in a sentence completed correctly in a word spelled right on the first attempt, that suggests whatever formal schooling the winter has interrupted has not managed to dampen her actual appetite for the learning itself. Ted, still too young for letters properly, watches this nightly ritual with a certain wistful attentiveness and has begun, unprompted, attempting to copy a few of the simpler shapes Grace makes, his own effort considerably less controlled, more a matter of enthusiasm than accuracy, but praised generously regardless, because a 6-year-old's first wobbling attempt at the letter that begins his own name deserves genuine celebration regardless of how far it strays from the ideal form. There is a gathering that comes toward the middle of this deep winter stretch that stands out from the ordinary run of quiet evenings, held in the largest barn belonging to a farmer a little further down the valley, a building emptied of most of its usual contents for this one evening and swept clean, lit by a generous collection of borrowed lanterns hung along the beams, filled by the better part of the parish's families, all bundled against the cold for the short walk or cart ride over. This is not a grand occasion by any measure beyond a household's own modest scale, but it carries, within the small world of this particular winter, something close to genuine festivity. A fiddler considerably more skilled than William brought in from a neighbouring parish, benches arranged along the walls for the older folk and the very young, and a cleared space in the middle where dancing of the simple, energetic country variety gets underway not long after the last family has arrived and shed their outer coats against the barn's own accumulated warmth, generated entirely by the press of so many bodies and the lantern's collective heat. Grace is old enough now to be included properly in some of the simpler dances, and spends much of the evening being spun and turned by a rotating cast of partners, cousins and neighbours, and once, briefly and with great solemnity on both sides, her own father, while Ted, not quite steady enough on his feet for the actual dancing, contents himself with a wild, joyful, entirely uncoordinated approximation of it near the edge of the cleared space, watched with amused affection by several of the seated grandmothers along the wall. There is cider passed around, and a modest spread of food contributed collectively by whichever household could spare what, and conversation that runs, as it always does at a gathering like this one, through every current concern the parish holds in common, the state of everyone's remaining wood stores this deep into February, hopeful early speculation about when the ground might finally soften enough to think about the coming planting. Sarah and William walk home from this gathering late, well past the children's usual bedtime, both of them carrying a sleepy child apiece for the last stretch of the lane, the cold sharp and clear around them, the sky above scattered thick with stars, and there is a particular warmth to this walk that has nothing to do with temperature, the lingering pleasure of an evening spent in genuine company, after so many weeks of a life narrowed mostly down to the four walls of their own small household. William remarks, at one point, low enough not to wake Ted dozing against his shoulder, that it is exactly this kind of evening that gets a person through the rest of a hard winter, and Sarah, adjusting her own hold on Grace's sleeping weight, agrees without needing to think about it very long, because she has known this particular truth herself for every one of her 11 winters in this valley, long before William ever said it aloud. There is a morning, deep in this same stretch of hard weather, when William returns from a routine errand later than expected, and though nobody in the household allows themselves to say the word worry aloud, Sarah finds her attention drifting more than once toward the window as the extra half hour stretches into a full one. When the cart does finally appear around the bend in the lane, it comes slower than usual, and William explains, once he is in and warming his hands properly by the fire, that a drift had built up deeper than expected across a low stretch of the road, deep enough to catch the wheel and hold it fast despite the horse's best determined effort, and that it had taken the arrival of a neighbour out on his own errand and spotting the trouble from some distance off to help free it, the two men working together with a spade borrowed from the neighbour's own cart, and a good deal of shared, good-natured cursing at the stubbornness of English winter roads before the wheel finally broke loose. He tells this story lightly, almost as a piece of minor comedy rather than any real trouble, and Grace and Ted both find it considerably more entertaining than their father seems to have found it at the time. But Sarah, listening, files the detail away quietly regardless. One more small reminder among many this season has offered of how thoroughly this whole small community depends on exactly this kind of unplanned, unhesitating mutual help. How a single stuck cartwheel on an empty winter road could, without some passing neighbour's willingness to stop and lend an hour of his own time, have turned into something considerably more serious than an amusing story told by the fire that same evening. There is a particular small discomfort that visits nearly everyone in the household at some point most days, the sharp, aching sting of hands gone properly cold from some outdoor task, water carrying or wood splitting or the walk to church, and the relief that follows, held close to the fire with fingers spread and flexing slowly as feeling creeps back in, has become its own small recognised ritual across the season, Ted in particular prone to dramatic complaint about this specific discomfort and equally dramatic relief once the fire has done its slow work, wiggling his fingers close to the flame with theatrical concentration until his mother reminds him, as she reminds him nearly every time, not to hold them quite so close, a little every year, and every year forgotten again within minutes. There is something almost companionable in this shared small suffering and shared small relief, a minor discomfort common enough across the whole household that nobody thinks to make more of it than the moment briefly warrants, forgotten again within a few minutes once the ache has properly eased and whatever task follows has claimed everyone's attention once more. There is a particular treat that appears in the household perhaps once or twice across the depth of the season, a batch of dark, spiced biscuits, heavy with ginger and a little treacle, baked specifically to be hard and long-keeping rather than soft, meant to be doled out a piece or two at a time across several weeks rather than consumed all at once. And Sarah mixes the dough for these on an afternoon when she has a little extra time and a little extra of the dear spices to spare, rolling it out thin and cutting it into simple rounds with the rim of a cup, since the household owns nothing so fanciful as a proper cutter for the purpose. Grace and Ted both hover close through this particular baking, drawn by the rich, warm, faintly peppery smell that fills the kitchen the moment the first tray goes into the heat, and there is a small, well-established ritual around the biscuits once they have cooled, one each allowed the same evening they are baked, the rest carefully stored away in a tin kept on a high shelf specifically to discourage the kind of repeated small raids that a full tin within easy reach would otherwise invite. There is a task that comes around perhaps once through the depth of a hard winter, when the household's supply of candles has dwindled enough to want replenishing before it runs dangerously low, and Sarah undertakes it on an afternoon when the weather keeps everyone indoors anyway, rendered tallow set to melt slowly in a pot near the fire's edge, the whole cottage filling with a smell that is not, if she is honest, a particularly pleasant one, faintly animal and thick in the back of the throat, though it is a smell so bound up with the practical business of keeping a household lit through the dark months that Sarah has long since stopped truly noticing it as unpleasant at all, the way anyone stops noticing a smell that simply belongs to a familiar task. The wicks, cut and trimmed in advance, hang from a simple wooden frame Sarah dips them from, one at a time, into the pot of melted tallow, then lifts clear to cool and harden for a few minutes before dipping again, layer building slowly over layer with each pass until the candle has thickened to something usable. It is slow, repetitive work, requiring patience more than skill, and Grace has been allowed, this particular winter, to try her own hand at a few of the simpler dips under close supervision, delighted each time by watching a thin, unpromising wick gradually transform, dip by careful dip, into something that will actually burn and give real light through some cold evening yet to come. Ted, deemed not quite ready for proximity to a pot of hot tallow, contents himself with watching from a careful distance, offering a steady stream of commentary on his sister's progress that Grace, absorbed in her own concentration, mostly ignores. By the time the last batch is finished and set out on a board near the window to finish cooling and hardening fully, the afternoon has slipped away almost entirely unnoticed. The way a task with this particular rhythm of repeated small motions tends to swallow time, and Sarah surveys the finished candles with the quiet, practical satisfaction of a woman who has just secured several more weeks of reliable evening light for her family, a satisfaction that has nothing showy about it and everything to do with the deep, steady comfort of a job that needed doing now properly done. Night itself, through these deepest weeks of winter, has developed its own particular character within the household, distinct enough from the daylight hours that it feels almost like a separate country the family passes into once the candles are finally snuffed and the fire banked down to its low overnight smoulder. The cottage settles into a different kind of quiet after everyone has gone up to bed, not silence exactly, because an old building like this one is never truly silent, its timbers creaking and settling as the temperature drops further outside, an occasional soft pop from the banked fire below, the low, steady sound of wind finding its way around the eaves on nights when it has not entirely died down with the daylight. Sarah, lying awake sometimes in these small hours longer than she means to, has come to find something oddly comforting in these particular sounds, the house's own quiet nighttime voice, familiar enough after 11 winters that any genuine change in it, any unfamiliar creak or shift, would likely wake her instantly, though nothing of that kind has ever actually happened, not in all her years in this house. The cold reaches its full depth in these small hours too, well past midnight and before the first grey suggestion of dawn, and there is a particular stillness to the world outside during this window that neither Sarah nor William, both usually asleep through it, ever actually witnesses directly, though both of them know it exists, have glimpsed it occasionally on the rare night one or the other rises briefly for some small necessity and catches, through the gap in the curtain, a glimpse of a frozen, moonlit, utterly motionless landscape stretching away from the cottage in every direction, snow catching what light there is, and holding it in a soft, pale glow that makes the whole sleeping world look, for just that brief glimpse, like something out of an old story rather than the same ordinary fields and lanes that will be entirely familiar again by full daylight. Early in this same stretch of hard winter, the parish observes a small old custom that William's own grandfather would have recognised without a moment's hesitation the first Monday after Twelfth Night given over, in years when the weather allows it, to a modest procession through the village behind a plough dressed with ribbon and greenery, farm hands and their families gathering to mark, in this half-serious, half-festive way, the years turning back toward the fields even while the ground itself remains locked hard under frost. This particular winter, the snow lies too deep and the lane too treacherous for anything like the full old custom, and the procession is abandoned in favour of a smaller, quieter gathering at the church instead. But William still walks out that morning to exchange a few words with the other men of the parish about it, a small wistful acknowledgement of a tradition temporarily set aside rather than one the village has any intention of losing altogether. Grace, hearing the story of the dressed plough from her father afterward, asks a great many questions about the ribbons and the greenery, and William promises her, with the easy confidence of a man making a promise about whether he cannot actually control, that next year, if the roads allow it, she will see the whole procession properly for herself. A little later in the season, on the 2nd day of February, the household observes Candlemas in its own small domestic way. The last of the season's greenery, the holly and ivy that decorated the mantel through Christmas, finally taken down and burned in the hearth, rather than simply discarded, a custom Sarah follows without much conscious thought beyond the plain memory of her own mother always doing the same, some things simply continuing in a family because they always have. The day carries, too, its own small folk reckoning about the weather still to come, an old saying about a clear, bright Candlemas promising more winter yet, and a dark, overcast one promising an earlier spring, and William recites this particular piece of half-serious wisdom to the children with a straight face that never quite fully commits to belief, watching out the window that morning with theatrical concern as the sky obliges by staying resolutely grey, a result he greets with exaggerated relief that leaves both children laughing before they have entirely worked out whether he was being serious. It is on this same day, traditionally, that a fresh full set of candles gets properly blessed and put into service in many parish households. And though the Whitlock's own practice is more practical than devotional, tied more to the calendar's convenient marking of the season's exact midpoint than to any deeper ceremony, Sarah does take a particular care that week in checking over the household's remaining candle stock, the batch she dipped herself earlier in the season now well into use, gauging carefully how many evenings of light still remain before another dipping will be wanted. A small, unglamorous piece of household accounting quietly folded into the day's older, gentler meaning. The thatch overhead, through all of these hard months, has done its own quiet work, largely unnoticed by anyone beneath it, holding snow in a thick insulating layer across the roof that William has explained to Grace more than once when she asks about the strange sight of their own roof staying white long after the surrounding fields have begun to show patches of bare ground, actually helps keep the house warmer rather than colder, the packed snow itself acting as a kind of blanket over the layers of reed and straw beneath it. There is a spot near the chimney, though, that wants watching every year, where the roof's own heat melts a small bare patch faster than the rest, and William climbs up on a mild enough afternoon partway through the season to check this particular vulnerable spot, adding a little fresh reed where the previous autumn's thatching has thinned, a small routine maintenance that matters enormously to keeping the whole household dry and warm, and that nobody below, wrapped in their own daily concerns, ever thinks to notice unless it goes wrong. There is a morning, somewhere past the middle of this hardest stretch, when Sarah steps outside earlier than usual to find something that stops her for a long moment on the doorstep. A small cluster of white flowers pushing up through a thin, melting patch of snow right along the base of the garden wall. Snowdrops, the very first sign the season has offered that it does eventually intend to end. She calls Grace out to see them before school, if school is even happening that particular week, and the two of them crouch together in the cold morning air, studying these small, improbable, hopeful things. And there is something in Grace's expression, a kind of quiet wonder that has nothing performed about it, that reminds Sarah, not for the first time this winter, why she has never really minded the hard work of this season nearly as much as she sometimes claims to. This does not mean the winter releases its grip all at once, and there will be, everyone in the household understands from long experience, several more hard frosts yet before the season properly loosens, perhaps even another real snowfall or two before it finally truly ends. But the lane, on the mildest afternoons now, has begun to show the first unmistakable signs of the thaw that will eventually, weeks from now, transform it entirely, patches of mud emerging where solid frozen ground held firm just days before, a treacherous new hazard in its own right that William navigates with just as much care as he ever gave the ice, aware that a cart bogged in fresh mud presents its own particular set of problems, distinct from but no less troublesome than a cart skidding on ice. The animals seem to feel this shift before the humans of the household quite consciously register it themselves. The horse a little more restless in its stable on the milder days, William notes, testing the air near the open stable door in a way that suggests some instinct older and more reliable than any calendar. There is talk in these weeks that has begun turning toward the spring's coming demands, toward lambing not too many weeks off now for the farmers who keep sheep in the parish, toward the fields that will need turning as soon as the ground softens enough to make it worthwhile, toward seed that has been carefully stored through the winter and will soon want planting. William spends one of these milder afternoons going through the seed store with the same careful attention Sarah gave the pantry weeks earlier, checking for any sign of damp or spoilage, a task that belongs properly to the season just now beginning to make itself felt rather than the one still technically underway. Grace, on one of these transitional afternoons, asks her mother whether she is sad that winter is ending, a question posed with the genuine curiosity of a child trying to understand an adult's more complicated relationship with something she herself experiences mostly as excitement about the coming milder weather. And Sarah considers this, honestly, before answering, admitting that there are things about this particular season she will genuinely miss. The long, unhurried evenings by the fire chief among them, the particular closeness a hard winter forces onto a family that spends so many of its hours together in these few warm rooms rather than scattered across a farm's wider work. But she tells Grace too that she is glad, genuinely glad, to feel the season turning, because a person can love a thing and still be ready, in its proper time, to let it go. And Grace files this particular piece of wisdom away with the same quiet seriousness she has given several others across this long winter, not fully understanding it yet, perhaps, but sensing, correctly, that it is worth holding on to for later. Winter, though, has never been a season inclined to release its hold neatly, or in a single smooth decline, and the household learns this again, as they do most years, when a final hard cold snap arrives well into what had begun to feel like the season's gentler final stretch, dropping the temperature back down harder than it has been in weeks, and bringing with it a fresh scatter of snow that undoes, in a single night, most of the modest thaw the lane had managed. William, who had allowed himself to think the worst of the cold might genuinely be behind them, finds himself once again breaking a thick skin of ice from the water trough on a morning he had not expected to need to, and there is a particular, weary, familiar quality to the way he sets about it, less surprise than a kind of resigned acknowledgement that the season simply is not finished making its demands, not yet, regardless of what the snowdrops along the garden wall might have suggested. Sarah, for her part, takes this final cold turn with the same practical steadiness she has brought to every earlier stretch of the season, the fire built back up with the same careful attention it received back in the depths of January, the extra wool layers pulled back out of the chest where they had, just barely, begun to be set aside. There is no real frustration in how she manages this, only the settled competence of a woman who has done this exact thing, in one form or another, 11 times before, and understands, without needing to be told, that a hard winter rarely ends all at once, that it tends instead to loosen its grip in stages, 2 steps of thaw followed reliably by 1 step of retreat, until eventually, almost without anyone quite marking the precise moment it happens, the retreat stops coming and only the thaw remains. Grace is disappointed by this backward turn, in a way only a child fully invested in the promise of spring's approach can be disappointed, staring out at the fresh snow with something close to genuine indignation, as though the weather has personally broken a promise made specifically to her, and Sarah, hiding her own amusement at this reaction, reminds her gently of the snowdrops still there beneath the new snow, waiting, unharmed, for the thaw to properly resume, a small lesson in patience that Grace accepts with considerably less grace than her name might suggest, though she accepts it nonetheless. This last cold stretch holds for the better part of a week, evenings once again filled with the same deep winter rhythm the family has grown so thoroughly accustomed to across the preceding months, knitting and mending and reading aloud, the fire built high and carefully tended, Ted once more coaxed briefly outside on a clear night to look up at a sky gone bright and hard with cold sharpened stars, though this particular excursion runs shorter than the January ones did, both father and son more eager, this late in the season, to get back to the fire's warmth than they were willing to admit through the deeper cold of midwinter. There is an evening within this final cold stretch, though, that carries a particular tenderness to it that Sarah will likely remember longer than most of the ordinary ones that preceded it, an evening when a fierce little squall blows through after dark, rattling the shutters in a brief, sharp reminder of worse nights weeks earlier, and Ted, startled awake by the noise of it, comes padding down the cold stairs in his night clothes, rather than calling out from his room the way he might have done as a smaller child, and simply climbs, without a word, into his mother's lap by the fire, where William is still finishing some small repair by candlelight. Nobody comments on it particularly. Sarah simply shifts to make room, wraps an arm around him, and continues on with whatever quiet conversation had been running between herself and William before the interruption, and Ted, warmed and reassured by nothing more elaborate than his mother's steady presence and the familiar crackle of the fire, is asleep again within a few minutes, and stays there, a solid warm weight against her, for the better part of an hour before William finally carries him back up to bed. There is a particular sound that marks this thaw as genuine in a way the earlier false one never quite managed. A steady, irregular dripping from the eaves as accumulated snow finally, properly softens and lets go, audible from indoors on the mildest afternoons as a constant, faint percussion against the frozen ground below, and Ted takes to standing beneath a particularly active drip point near the door some afternoons, watching each individual drop fall and land with the same solemn fascination he has brought to nearly every other small natural phenomenon this whole long winter has offered him. By the time this final cold snap breaks, releasing at last into a thaw that holds this time, genuinely holds, without the earlier stretch's false promise, the household has settled into a particular kind of tired satisfaction that comes only from having gotten a family fully through a genuinely hard winter, stores intact, everyone healthy and warm, the accumulated small competencies of 11 years of marriage and 11 winters of practice, all having done, once again, exactly what they were meant to do. I want to spend a few minutes on the small objects of this household, because I think they carry more of this family's story than any single event I could describe to you. There are objects in a house like this one that carry more weight than their size would suggest, small things handled every single day that nobody thinks to remark upon, and that would, if any one of them were suddenly missing, leave a gap felt immediately by everyone in the household, even if nobody could quite articulate why. The black iron cooking pot that hangs on its hook beside the hearth is one of these, worn smooth and dark with years of use, older than Sarah's marriage itself, having belonged first to William's own mother and passed down to this kitchen, the way such essential, practical things tend to pass through a family, valued not for any beauty in them, but for the sheer accumulated history of every meal they have made possible. Sarah could not begin to count the stews and porridges and boiled puddings that pot has produced across the years, and there is something almost companionable in how she reaches for it each evening without conscious thought, the handle worn now to a shape that fits her own grip, with a familiarity built from thousands of repetitions. The salt cellar on the kitchen shelf holds a similar quiet significance, a small carved wooden box that was a wedding gift from Sarah's own mother. Salt itself a substance valuable enough in earlier generations to warrant real ceremony around its handling, and though salt has grown considerably more affordable in Sarah's own lifetime than it was in her grandmother's, something of that older reverence has lingered in how carefully she still measures it out, a pinch at a time, never wasted, the little wooden lid always closed again promptly after use, as though old habits of scarcity persist quietly beneath more comfortable modern circumstances. William's coat, that same coat that has now done 12 winters, having survived this particular season's demands with only the one small repair to its lining, hangs on its peg by the door through the milder months, and comes back into daily use each autumn with a kind of unspoken ceremony, brushed off and checked over before its first proper wearing of the new cold season, and there is something in how carefully it has been maintained across so many years that speaks to an entire philosophy of living neither Sarah nor William would ever put into such grand language themselves, a simple practical faith that a good thing, properly cared for, will keep giving service far longer than anyone might expect, that mending is nearly always preferable to replacing, that waste is a kind of carelessness this household simply does not practice, not out of any particular virtue so much as plain necessity long since become genuine habit. The fiddle, Sarah's father's fiddle, holds perhaps the deepest quiet significance of anything in the house, and she handles it always with a particular careful tenderness distinct from how she handles anything else, tuning it by ear before each evening's playing with an attentiveness that has nothing to do with any real musical training and everything to do with simply having heard her father tune this exact instrument so many hundreds of times across her own childhood that the correct sound lives in her memory as clearly as any spoken word. She does not play especially well by any formal measure, and would be the first to say so if asked, but there is something in the particular tunes she reaches for, the same handful her father favoured, that carries her own childhood forward into her children's evenings in a way words alone could never quite manage, and Grace, without perhaps fully understanding why, has already begun asking to be taught a little of it herself. Small clumsy attempts at the simplest tunes that Sarah encourages, with a patience born of understanding exactly what she is really passing along in these lessons. Ted's carved wooden animals, worn smooth now at every edge from years of handling by hands smaller than his own before they ever reached him, belonged in turn to Grace, and before Grace to a cousin now grown and moved away, and before that cousin to some earlier child in the family whose exact identity has become uncertain across the passing years, the animals themselves having simply outlasted the memory of precisely how many small hands have shaped their wear. There is no great sentimentality attached to this in any spoken way. Nobody in the household would describe the animals as precious exactly, but they persist, generation after generation of children within this same extended family, in a way that speaks quietly to how little, in a household like this one, ever gets thrown away while it still has use left in it, how the ordinary objects of daily life accumulate their own kind of history simply by being handled, carefully, across enough years and enough hands. There is a particular hour, most evenings across this whole long season, when the candlelight and the firelight settle into exactly the right balance against each other, not so early that the room still holds traces of the grey daylight competing against it, not so late that the fire is burned down too far to add its own warm colour to the mix, and Sarah has come, across these many months, to recognise this hour almost by feel rather than by any clock, a particular quality to the light in the room that she could not fully explain but would notice instantly if it were somehow different. The candle on the table throws a small, steady, warm circle of light across whatever work occupies her hands, while the fire behind it sends a larger, more restless glow flickering up the walls and across the low-beamed ceiling, the two lights meeting somewhere in the middle of the room in a soft shifting overlap that makes even the most ordinary evening feel, in this particular window of time, faintly golden. Shadows move through this light in ways that have become, across so many repeated evenings, almost like familiar company rather than mere absence of illumination. William's shadow thrown long and shifting across the far wall whenever he leans forward to tend the fire, Grace's smaller shadow bent over her slate or her knitting, growing and shrinking slightly as she shifts her weight, the particular dance of shadow and light that any room lit only by fire and candle produces, nothing in it ever quite still, everything in gentle, constant, barely perceptible motion. There is something almost hypnotic in watching this, if you let your attention settle into it properly, the way the fire's light pulses very slightly with each small shift of the burning logs, the way a draught finding its way past the door's edge sets the candle flame trembling for just a moment before it steadies again. Sarah finds herself, on certain evenings, simply watching this play of light and shadow across the familiar walls of her own kitchen rather than actively working at whatever task sits in her lap. Her hands gone still for a few minutes at a time, her mind drifting somewhere loose and unfocused in a way she rarely allows herself during the busier daylight hours. There is a particular permission in these quiet firelit evenings that the rest of the day simply does not offer, a permission to slow down entirely, to let a thought trail off unfinished, to watch a shadow move across a wall for no reason beyond the simple pleasure of watching it. March arrives eventually, as it always does, bringing with it a different quality of weather than anything the deep winter months offered. Not warm exactly, not yet, but carrying within its cold a different character, a dampness rather than the dry, hard bite of January, a wind that smells faintly, on its milder days, of thawing earth rather than only of wood smoke and snow. The lane has softened considerably now, mud more often the concern than ice, and William's trips to the village have resumed their more frequent ordinary rhythm, the careful spaced-out caution of the deepest winter no longer strictly necessary. There is a particular afternoon in this transitional stretch when Grace, out in the garden helping her mother assess which of the overwintered plants have survived the season's worst, discovers a second small cluster of green pushing up through the softening soil near the base of the wall. Not snowdrops this time, but something new, and calls her mother over with genuine excitement to examine it, and Sarah, crouching beside her daughter in the cool, damp, faintly earth-scented air of early March, feels something settle in her chest that she recognizes, every single year around this same point in the season, as something close to relief, though relief is perhaps too dramatic a word for feelings this quiet and this familiar. The winter, this particular winter, 11 winters into her married life now, has been managed, the stores held. The fire never once truly failed them. Everyone in this small household is healthy and warm and, on an afternoon like this one, crouched together over a small green shoot in the softening garden earth, genuinely and quietly happy. The household keeps a small flock of hens through the winter months, sheltered in a low wooden coop tucked against the sunniest wall of the stable, and their care through the coldest weeks becomes its own small daily discipline, distinct from but no less important than the larger tasks of fire and water and firewood that dominate most accounts of a household's winter labour. Hens lay poorly in the deep cold and the shortened daylight, a fact of the season everyone in a house like this one simply accepts without complaint, and Sarah counts herself fortunate on any morning through January and February that yields even 2 or 3 eggs from the whole flock, where a summer morning might offer twice that number without any particular effort. Ted has been given the job of checking the coop each morning, a task he performs with real dedication despite the cold, delighted out of all proportion by the discovery of even a single egg on a morning when the hens have been especially reluctant, and disappointed, briefly and dramatically, on mornings when the search comes up entirely empty. Grain gets carried out to them twice daily regardless of the weather, because a hungry hen through a hard winter is a hen at real risk, and William has banked straw thick around the base of the coop as an extra defence against the cold finding its way in through the boards, checking, on the harder mornings, that the small water dish kept inside has not frozen through entirely overnight, breaking whatever skin of ice has formed with the same practiced motion he uses on the larger trough outside. There is a particular hen, an old speckled bird gone a little lame in one leg the previous autumn, that Sarah has taken to bringing scraps to beyond the ordinary grain ration, a small private kindness she would likely deny doing if anyone remarked on it, though everyone in the household has quietly noticed. There is a churn kept in the corner of the small scullery off the kitchen that gets real use through these winter months, though the household does not keep its own cow, the cream itself coming instead from a small weekly arrangement with a farm further along the lane, whose dairy herd, wintered mostly indoors and fed on good hay, still manages a reliable if reduced output through the coldest stretch. Sarah works the churn's handle herself most weeks, a steady, monotonous cranking that takes the better part of half an hour before the cream finally, almost suddenly, breaks and gathers into soft yellow clumps of butter floating in the thin, watery buttermilk left behind. And there is a particular satisfaction in that moment of transformation, sudden after so much unremarkable repetitive effort that never quite loses its small pleasure, no matter how many hundreds of times she has produced it across her years running this kitchen. Grace has been allowed a turn at the handle this particular winter, though her arms tire long before the cream shows any sign of turning, and she hands the task back to her mother each time, with the slightly aggrieved dignity of someone convinced the job would go faster if only she were a little older and a little stronger. Once the butter has gathered, it gets worked with a pair of wooden paddles, pressed and pressed again to force out the last of the buttermilk, then salted lightly and shaped into a firm block that goes into the coolest corner of the pantry to keep through the coming week, the leftover buttermilk itself never wasted, worked instead into that week's baking, or given to the hens, who take to it. William has always claimed with more conviction than evidence, with particular enthusiasm. Wool, beyond what gets knitted directly into finished garments through the winter evenings, requires its own earlier stages of preparation that happen, in this household, mostly during the quieter stretches of deep midwinter when outdoor work has slowed to its lowest ebb. Raw fleece, saved from the previous year's shearing and cleaned through the autumn, gets carded on certain afternoons, Sarah working two flat wooden paddles studded with fine wire teeth against each other, drawing the tangled wool between them again and again until the fibers align into something soft and workable, rather than the matted, unruly mass it began as. This is slow, repetitive, faintly meditative work, not unlike the knitting it eventually feeds into, and Grace has begun, this particular winter, to be trusted with a little of it herself, her small hands not yet strong enough to manage a full paddle's worth in one motion, but capable, with patient guidance, of producing a passable rowlog or two before her attention wanders elsewhere. A letter arrives partway through the season, carried out from the village post along with William's other errands, from Sarah's sister settled some distance away in a larger town, and this becomes, for an evening or two, a small genuine event within the household's usual rhythm, read aloud by William once the children have gathered close enough to listen, full of news about cousins Grace and Ted have met only a handful of times but ask after eagerly regardless, about a new baby arrived safely despite the hard weather, about the different, noisier character of winter in a town full of gas lamps and factory smoke, rather than the quiet lanes and open fields this household knows. Sarah composes her own reply over several evenings, a slow, careful process by candlelight, ink and paper being dear enough that a letter gets thought through properly before it gets committed to the page, and there is something in the writing of it, in choosing which small details of this winter's ordinary life feel worth sharing across the distance to a sister who left this same valley years before, that makes Sarah newly aware, for a little while, of the particular shape and texture of the life she and William have built here. Church bells, on the clearer, stiller days, carry further across the frozen fields than they ever seem to manage in the thicker air of summer, and the household has learnt, across years of living within earshot of them, to mark certain hours of the day by their distant, muffled ringing, a habit so ingrained that Sarah sometimes catches herself glancing toward the window at the sound of them, even on days when she already knows perfectly well what time it is, by the state of whatever task currently occupies her hands. There is something comforting in this, a small, steady, external rhythm laid over the household's own internal one, a reminder, however faint and distant, that this cottage and this family exist within a wider community, following the same hours, marking the same passage of the same long winter days together, even when weeks pass without any face-to-face contact beyond the immediate household itself. Owls call some nights from the edge of the small woodland where William cuts his firewood, a low, carrying sound that Ted found frightening his first winter old enough to properly notice it, and has, across the subsequent years, come to find something closer to comforting, a familiar voice belonging to the dark outside rather than any real threat, and William asked once by a much younger Ted what the owls were saying to each other out there in the cold black woods, invented on the spot an elaborate answer involving owl gossip about the state of the season that has become, over the years, something close to family legend, repeated and embellished a little further nearly every winter since. The kitchen garden, that small fenced plot behind the cottage that in summer produces the bulk of what fills the family's table, spends the whole of this long winter looking, to any casual glance, like nothing more than an unremarkable stretch of snow-covered ground, indistinguishable from the field beyond the wall. But beneath that unpromising white surface, certain hardier things have been left deliberately in the ground through the cold months, root vegetables that keep better left where they grew than lifted and stored, and William makes periodic trips out to this buried garden through the winter with a fork and a determined patience, breaking through frozen crust and packed snow to lift whatever the week's cooking requires, a task considerably harder than the simple business of pulling a carrot in October, but one that yields, in exchange for the extra effort, vegetables fresher than anything the pantry's stored stock could offer. The root cellar itself, dug into the rising ground just behind the stable, holds its own particular winter atmosphere, cool and dark and earthy smelling, a sanctuary of stable, unchanging temperature that neither the deepest frost above nor the occasional milder afternoon much affects, and Sarah descends its few worn stone steps several times a week through the season, a candle held carefully ahead of her, to check on the stores kept there, sacks of the sturdier vegetables, a barrel of apples, and to select whatever the coming day's meals will need. There is a particular hush to this small underground space that she has always found faintly pleasant, a quiet entirely different from the busy warmth of the kitchen above, and she has more than once found herself lingering there a minute or two longer than strictly necessary, simply enjoying the cool, dark, earth-scented stillness of it, before climbing back up into the noise and warmth of her family's daily life. The warming pan gets a mention here that has been implied through much of this account without ever being properly described. A long-handled brass vessel filled with hot coals from the evening fire and passed briefly between the sheets of the children's beds before they climb in, not left there, never left unattended, but swept back and forth a few times across the cold linen with practiced speed to take the worst chill off before being withdrawn entirely, the coals inside it glowing faintly through the pierced lid in the dim upstairs room. Grace has been allowed, this particular winter, to hold the pan's handle herself under close supervision for the last few passes across her own bed. A small responsibility she takes with predictable seriousness, and there is something in the warmth this simple brass object provides, brief and modest as it is against the whole long cold night ahead, that both children have come to associate so completely with the comfort of bedtime that Grace has admitted, more than once, to missing it faintly during the milder months when it sits unused on its hook by the hearth. There is an evening well into this long winter's second half that echoes in certain small ways the very first evening of the season back when the snow first fell, though neither Sarah nor William would think to draw the comparison explicitly themselves. The fire is built the same way. The candles are lit at the same hour. Grace still presses her palm against the cold window glass some evenings, though her interest now runs more toward watching for any sign of the thaw's progress than toward simple wonder at falling snow. Ted has grown just slightly across these months, in the particular way children grow through a long season without anyone quite noticing until a coat that fit perfectly in November suddenly strains a little at the shoulders by March. The rhythms have held steady even as the individual days accumulated into something that now, looking back, feels less like a sequence of separate mornings and evenings and more like a single long continuous season the family has moved through together, one sustained stretch of fire and frost and firelight and quiet, ordinary, deeply lived togetherness. There is a particular warm drink that appears in this household on the very coldest evenings. A simple mixture of warmed milk with a little honey stirred through it, and, occasionally when William has managed to trade for it, a scraping of nutmeg grated fine across the top, and it becomes, through the hardest weeks of the season, a small nightly ceremony all its own, passed around in the family's few good cups while the fire burns down toward its evening low. Grace has decided, this particular winter, that she prefers hers with slightly more honey than her mother thinks strictly wise, a small ongoing negotiation that plays out most evenings with the same predictable good-natured back and forth, and Ted, still working on developing genuine patience, has learnt the hard way, more than once, that milk warmed too eagerly close to the fire scalds a hasty tongue, considerably more than the wait to let it cool would have cost him. Dinner on an ordinary evening this deep into the season carries its own particular richness by now, built from months of practiced adjustment to exactly what stretches furthest and satisfies best against a long cold evening ahead. There might be a thick soup, the pale gold colour of it deepened by hours of slow simmering, root vegetables gone soft enough to nearly dissolve on the tongue, a little barley giving it real substance, served alongside bread, still faintly warm if the timing of the baking has worked out well, the crust giving way to a soft, slightly chewy interior that soaks up the last of the soup from the bottom of the bowl in a way Ted has perfected into something close to an art form, much to his mother's mild and affectionate disapproval of the resulting mess. There might be, on a luckier evening, a little bacon fried alongside a good measure of cabbage and potato, the fat rendered from it used afterward to enrich whatever gets cooked next. Nothing in a kitchen like this one ever quite going to waste if there is any way at all to make further use of it. The windows of the cottage, small and deep set into thick stone walls, let in light through the day in a particular quality that changes constantly with the hour and the weather, a pale, cool, slightly blue-tinged light on the clearest cold mornings, something flatter and greyer on the overcast days that make up the greater share of any English winter, a brief, low, golden slant in the last half hour before sunset, on the rare afternoons the clouds part enough to allow it, catching the dust motes stirred up by the day's activity and turning them, for just those few minutes, into something that looks almost deliberately beautiful, rather than merely the ordinary residue of a lived-in room. Grace has taken, across this long season, to noticing this particular late golden light more than she used to, pausing at whatever task occupies her to simply watch it move slowly across the floor and up the far wall, before it fades entirely into the blue-grey of full dusk, a small private appreciation she has not quite articulated even to herself, but that Sarah, watching her daughter watch the light, recognizes with quiet private pleasure as something of her own passed down, without either of them ever having discussed it directly. There are smaller residents of the cottage through these winter months too, not always welcome ones. A family of mice that has taken up residence somewhere behind the pantry wall, despite William's periodic, only moderately successful efforts to discourage them, and Ted has developed over the season a soft spot for these unofficial housemates that his parents find more amusing than they let on, leaving out the smallest, most begrudged of offerings for what he has decided, with complete conviction, is a single friendly mouse he has named and grown genuinely fond of, rather than the shifting, rotating cast of several mice his parents suspect is closer to the truth. Sarah draws a firm line at anything that threatens the actual food stores, and the pantry itself stays carefully secured against real incursion, but the odd crumb left deliberately near the hearth on a cold night strikes her, on balance, as a harmless enough kindness to allow her son one more small, quiet act of generosity in a household that has, across this whole long season, practiced generosity in dozens of small, unremarked ways toward every creature, human and otherwise, that shares its particular corner of this cold English winter. William has begun this particular winter teaching Ted the very first, simplest beginnings of whittling, a skill Ted has been impatient to learn ever since he grew old enough to properly understand what his father was doing each time he sat by the fire working some small repair with a knife in hand. The lessons happen slowly, carefully, William's own hand guiding Ted's smaller one through the first tentative cuts into a soft block of pine set aside specifically for this purpose. Nothing ambitious attempted yet, simply the basic feel of the blade against the grain, how to draw it away from rather than toward oneself, how much pressure a piece of wood this soft actually requires before it yields. Ted's first efforts produce nothing recognizable as any particular object, small heaps of pale curling shavings and a block of wood gradually reduced in size without acquiring any clear new shape, but there is real pride in his concentration nonetheless, tongue caught between his teeth in an expression identical to the one Grace wears over her letters, and William watches this early clumsy effort with the particular patient satisfaction of a father recognizing, in his son's fierce concentration, something of his own younger self bent over this same task at this same hearth a generation before. There is a specific small pleasure the whole household has come to share this winter, repeated so many times across the season that it has become almost a private family joke, the particular sensation of stepping in from real outdoor cold into the cottage's gathered warmth, a wave of heat meeting the face and hands that feels, after even a short spell outside, almost solid enough to lean against. Grace has taken to narrating this sensation aloud nearly every time she comes in from some errand or game, a dramatic, theatrical sigh of relief performed with such consistency that Ted has begun imitating her, exaggerating his own return indoors into something bordering on a small performance, both children collapsing into giggles most times this particular joke gets repeated, though neither of them, nor either parent watching with quiet amusement from across the room, seems to tire of it, no matter how many times this same small winter comedy plays out. There is a particular hour on Sunday afternoons, once the walk home from church has concluded and the midday meal has been cleared away, that the household has come to treat as genuinely restful in a way distinct from the ordinary evenings, a stretch of time with no assigned chores attached to it at all, beyond the fire's basic ongoing tending, and the family fills it however each member happens to feel inclined that particular week. William might doze unashamedly in the chair nearest the fire, his head tipping slowly forward and back in the particular rhythm of a man who has genuinely earned an afternoon's rest. Grace might disappear into whatever book or half-finished sewing currently holds her interest, curled into the corner of the settle with her knees drawn up beneath her skirts. Ted, on the milder of these Sunday afternoons, is sometimes allowed a supervised hour outside regardless of the season, bundled thoroughly against the cold, simply to run off some of the restless energy that a week spent largely confined indoors tends to build up in a 6-year-old, regardless of how many small chores and games have been found to occupy him. Sarah's own version of this Sunday quiet often involves nothing more elaborate than sitting with a cup of tea gone lukewarm beside her, watching her family in their various states of restful occupation, and there is a particular kind of contentment in these hours that she has come to recognize as distinct even from the ordinary satisfaction of a well-managed evening, a sense of having, for this one stretch of the week, genuinely nothing that urgently needs doing, permission simply to exist within her own household rather than constantly managing it. She uses these quiet Sunday hours sometimes for her own small pleasures, a little reading of her own when the light and her energy both allow it, or simply sitting with her eyes closed, listening to the particular layered sounds of her family's Sunday idleness around her, William's soft snoring, the occasional turn of a page from Grace's corner, the fire's steady low crackle beneath it all. The fire itself, across the whole long span of this winter, has developed what feels almost like its own distinct voice depending on the hour and the wood and the weather outside, a voice Sarah has grown so intimately familiar with that she could likely identify, blindfolded, roughly what stage of burning any given fire has reached simply by its sound. Freshly built up with dry kindling, it snaps and pops in a quick, eager, almost chattering rhythm. Settled into its main burn with good solid logs, it produces a lower, steadier roar, occasionally punctuated by a deeper crack when some pocket of sap or trapped moisture in the wood finally gives way to the heat. Banked down for the night, it reduces to something closer to a whisper, a soft, continuous, barely audible hiss of settling coals that Sarah has fallen asleep to on so many hundreds of nights across her married life that she has come to find genuine, physical comfort in the sound itself, distinct from the warmth it also happens to provide, a background note beneath every single winter night this household has spent together in this particular small stone cottage. There is a particular attentiveness the whole household has developed, entirely without meaning to, toward the sound their own boots make against whatever the ground currently offers, a knowledge so gradual in its acquiring that nobody could say exactly when it settled into place. Fresh, soft snow gives underfoot with a quiet, muffled compression, almost no sound at all beyond a faint whisper of displaced powder. Older snow, packed hard by days of traffic and repeated freezing, rings out sharper, a crunch with real edge to it. Ice, when the boot finds it unexpectedly, offers almost no sound at all, only a brief heart-stopping slide that every member of the household has learned, across enough small stumbles this season, to catch and correct for almost before the conscious mind has registered the danger. Grace has become, without any particular instruction, quite skilled at reading the ground several steps ahead purely by its colour and texture in the pale winter light, a small practical competence she has absorbed simply by walking this same stretch of lane in every condition winter can offer, several times a week for the whole of this long season. Frost, on the coldest and stillest mornings of this long season, has painted the inside of the cottage windows with patterns that Sarah has never fully stopped marvelling at, however many winters she has now watched them form, delicate branching shapes that spread across the cold glass overnight like something between a forest and a fern, each one slightly different from the last, built by nothing more than the simple, patient chemistry of moisture and cold working together, while the household sleeps unaware just a few feet away. Grace has taken, across this particular season, to keeping a small private collection of favourites in her memory, certain mornings' patterns she found especially beautiful, describing them sometimes at breakfast with the earnest, detailed enthusiasm of someone determined that her mother should fully appreciate what she has apparently missed by not examining the window closely enough herself. There was the morning, early in the deepest cold, when the pattern spread in a shape Grace insisted looked exactly like a whole miniature forest, complete with what she swore were individual trees if you looked closely enough. There was another, later, that reminded her, she announced with great confidence, of the feathers on the hawk that sometimes circles the far field, though William, examining it himself with polite skepticism, allowed only that he could see how a 9-year-old's imagination might arrive at that particular comparison. These patterns vanish, of course, the moment the room's gathering daytime warmth reaches them properly, each morning's careful frozen artwork dissolving into nothing more than an ordinary damp pane by mid-morning. And there is something in this quiet, daily, unremarked cycle of creation and dissolution that Sarah has come, without ever quite putting the thought into words, to find deeply peaceful, evidence of a whole intricate process happening constantly, beautifully, and entirely without any need for an audience, right there on her own kitchen window, whether anyone in the household happens to notice it on any particular morning or not. There is a night, well past the season's coldest point but still solidly within its grip, when Sarah lies awake longer than usual after everyone else in the house has settled, not from any worry or discomfort, simply from the particular wakefulness that sometimes visits a person in the deep, quiet hours, regardless of how tired the day's labour left them. She listens, in this unplanned stretch of stillness, to the house's familiar nighttime sounds, the low settling creak of old timber cooling further as the fire below burns down toward its lowest ebb, the faint whisper of wind finding its usual small gaps around the shutters, William's steady, unhurried breathing beside her, and somewhere above, through the thin ceiling boards, the occasional soft shift and sigh of one or the other of the children turning over in their sleep. She thinks, in this quiet, unhurried stretch of wakefulness, about nothing in particular and everything at once, the way a mind left alone in the dark tends to wander, touching briefly on the coming spring's demands, the seed that will want planting soon, on Grace's steadily improving letters, on Ted's small, proud, whittled shavings swept up each evening from the hearth, on William's quiet, steady, undemonstrative devotion to this household that she has never once, across 11 years of marriage, had real cause to doubt. There is nothing dramatic in any of this thinking. It simply moves, unhurried, the way the fire's own low light moves across the ceiling above her, and eventually, without her quite marking the exact moment it happens, her own breathing settles into the same slow rhythm as her sleeping family's, and the house, fully now, is quiet. The final proper snowfall of the season arrives without any particular fanfare, a modest scattering rather than anything like the deep, committed fall that opened the whole long winter back at its start, and nobody in the household quite recognizes it, at the time, as the last one, only understanding it retrospectively, weeks later, once enough mild days have passed without any further white to make the earlier snow's finality clear in hindsight. William notes it mostly as a minor inconvenience to the morning's chores rather than any occasion worth remarking on, the ground already soft enough beneath that this new dusting melts away again within a single day, leaving behind only a faint damp darkening of the earth where it briefly lay. There is, in these final weeks of the true cold season, a particular unhurried quality to the household's remaining winter tasks, less urgent now than they were through the deepest months, when every single fire and every carefully rationed candle carried real weight against the possibility of a genuinely hard stretch still to come. Sarah still tends the hearth with the same basic care she has practiced all season, but there is a loosening in it now, a willingness to let the fire burn a little lower some evenings than she would have permitted back in January, confident in a way she simply was not a few months earlier that the household's remaining wood will comfortably outlast whatever cold still remains to be weathered. Market day, when William makes his next trip into the village, carries a different character than the earlier ones this season did, the lane firm enough underfoot now that the cart makes easy work of the journey, other travellers on the road more numerous than they have been in months, the whole small community visibly stirring back into its fuller seasonal activity after months of the deep winter's necessary contraction. There is talk outside the shop, when he arrives, of little else besides the coming spring's demands, whose fields will be turned first, whose lambing has already begun, and William finds himself drawn easily into this shifting seasonal conversation, the household's own attention, like everyone else's in the parish, beginning quietly to turn forward, toward planting and growth, and the long bright stretch of the year that still lies, for now, just beyond the horizon. Grace and Ted, on the milder afternoons that have begun arriving with increasing regularity now, spend more of their time outdoors than they have in months, and there is a particular joy in watching them rediscover the wider reach of the garden and the lane and the field edge beyond it, territory that shrank through the depths of winter down to whatever narrow, carefully bundled excursion the weather would allow, now expanding back out, day by day, into something closer to its full accustomed range. Sarah watches them from the kitchen window some afternoons, this small unhurried reclaiming of ground, and feels something in it that mirrors, in its own quiet way, everything the whole household has felt across this long season. A patient, steady, unremarkable endurance finally, gently, being rewarded. But there is one more true winter evening still to come before the season fully releases its hold. A night late in this transitional stretch when the mild days give way, briefly, to a return of proper hard frost, clear skies drawing all the day's gathered warmth back up into a sky gone sharp and starlit by full dark, and the household, almost gratefully, falls back into the deep winter rhythm one final time, as though the whole family has quietly missed it in the weeks since the thaw properly began. The fire gets built up generously, the way it was built on so many nights across the preceding months. The candles come down from their shelf. Sarah takes up her knitting, nearly finished now, a scarf that has occupied her hands through the greater part of this long season, and wants only a few more rows before it can finally be called complete. William settles into his usual chair with a small repair in hand, though there is less urgent need for it now than there was through the depths of January, the household's various small breakages having mostly, by this point in the season, already been addressed across the many quiet evenings that preceded this one. He works at it anyway, unhurried, more for the familiar pleasure of the task itself than any real necessity, and there is something in this small voluntary continuation of a winter habit, practiced now simply for its own sake rather than out of strict need, that speaks to how thoroughly this whole household has come to value these particular evening hours across the span of the season, regardless of whether the cold outside still demands them. Grace reads to herself now, mostly, rather than being read to. Her letters improved enough across the winter's many fireside lessons that she manages whole pages on her own, with only occasional help, and there is real pride in William's face watching her that he does not bother trying to hide, the particular pride of a father who has spent a good many patient evenings guiding a small hand across a slate, and can now watch that same hand turn pages independently, following a story entirely under her own steam. Ted, grown just visibly across these months, whittles alongside his father with his own small block of pine, producing, this particular evening, something that has finally begun to resemble, if you squint and are inclined toward generosity, the rough shape of a small dog, a genuine accomplishment he announces to the room with considerable pride and receives, in return, the enthusiastic praise it deserves regardless of how rough the actual carving remains. Outside, the last hard frost of the season settles over a landscape that has, across these transitional weeks, already begun to show far more bare ground than white, patches of the field visible now, where deep unbroken snow held solid for months, the stream running freely again beneath its banks, rather than locked beneath ice, and yet the cold tonight is genuine, sharp enough that William, stepping out briefly to check the animals one final time before the household settles for the night, finds his own breath clouding thick in the still, star-bright air exactly as it did on the coldest nights back in January. He stands a moment longer than the task strictly requires, looking up at that clear, star-scattered sky one more time. And there is something in this particular moment, alone in the frozen dark with the whole quiet season's accumulated weight somehow present in it, that catches at him unexpectedly, a full wordless awareness of everything this winter has asked of this household, and everything it has, in exchange, quietly given them, warmth earned through daily careful labour, closeness built from so many shared fireside evenings, a season endured not merely by surviving it, but by genuinely, deeply living inside it, together, from its first snowfall to this, very likely, its last hard frost. He does not have words for this feeling, not really, would not think to reach for any if asked, but he carries it back inside with him nonetheless, into the warm, candle-lit kitchen where his family waits, and settles back into his chair by the fire beside them. Bedtime, on this particular final cold evening, follows the same careful ritual it has followed on so many hundreds of nights across the season, though there is a kind of gentle, unspoken tenderness to it tonight that neither parent could quite explain if asked. A sense of performing, perhaps for one of the last times this year, a set of small motions that have become, across these months, so completely woven into the fabric of the household's daily life that they will be genuinely missed once the milder nights ahead no longer require them. The warming pan comes down from its hook and gets filled with fresh coals, swept carefully across the cold linen of each child's bed, the way it has been swept nearly every night since that first proper snowfall, so many weeks ago now. Night clothes go on layered thick, one final time, flannel and wool against skin, though everyone in the household understands, without needing to discuss it, that these particular thick layers will soon enough be traded back for the lighter things that have sat folded and waiting in the chest since autumn. Grace, old enough now to manage most of her own preparation, still lingers a moment at her window before climbing into bed, looking out at the same clear, star-scattered sky her father stood beneath a little earlier, and there is something in her expression, caught briefly in the last light of the candle her mother carries, that suggests she too senses, however dimly, that something is quietly ending tonight, some particular chapter of the year drawing itself gently closed even as the promise of a new one waits just beyond it. She does not say anything about this. She simply watches the stars a moment longer than usual before finally climbing in, and Sarah, tucking the blankets close around her daughter's shoulders with the same practiced firmness she has used all season, presses a kiss to her forehead and blows out the candle, leaving the room lit only by the faint borrowed glow that reaches up the stairs from the kitchen fire below. Ted is already half asleep by the time his mother reaches his small bed, worn out from an evening's determined whittling and the day's earlier outdoor excursion in the returning cold, and he barely stirs as she settles the blankets around him and presses her own kiss to his forehead, murmuring something low and wordless that is less a specific good night than simply the accumulated tenderness of an entire long winter spent keeping this particular small boy warm and fed and safe through every single one of its coldest nights. Downstairs, once the house above has gone properly quiet, William banks the fire for what both he and Sarah privately suspect, without quite saying so aloud to each other, may be one of the last times this season it will need banking with quite this much care, arranging the coals in that same familiar pattern that will hold a low, steady warmth through the dark hours ahead, without demanding the full careful vigilance the deepest winter nights required. They sit together a little longer in the fire's diminishing glow, not speaking much, the particular comfortable silence of two people who have spent an entire hard season managing a household side by side, and have in the process grown only closer for the shared effort of it, rather than worn thin by it, which is not, they both understand without needing to say it, something every marriage manages to achieve across a winter this demanding. William says eventually, quiet, more observation than declaration, that they are nearly through it. Sarah nods, watching the last of the flames settle low over the banked coals, and agrees, nearly. Neither of them says anything more for a while. There is nothing more really that needs saying. The fire ticks and settles in the grate. Somewhere above, the house holds its two sleeping children in the particular safe, warm stillness this hearth and these walls have provided every single night since the season's very first snowfall, and outside, past the shuttered window, the last hard frost of this long winter continues its quiet, star-bright work over a landscape that has in every direction the eye can reach already begun, however faintly, however patiently, turning itself back toward spring. If you were to gather up this whole long winter and hold it all at once, every morning and every evening of it laid together rather than strung out across so many separate weeks, you would find, underneath all the individual detail, a single steady shape repeating itself again and again, with only the smallest variations, the shape of a fire built and tended and banked, a family gathered close around its warmth, a lane walked carefully out and carefully back, a child's small chore performed and a small pride taken in it, a candle lit against the dark and blown out again once the dark had been sufficiently held off for one more night. This repetition is not in itself a small thing. It is in fact very nearly the entire substance of what got this household safely from one edge of a hard season to the other. Not any single dramatic effort, but this patient, unglamorous, endlessly repeated care, morning after morning, evening after evening, week folding quietly into week until an entire winter had somehow, gently, been gotten through. Think of the snow as it first fell that opening morning, thick and unhurried over the sleeping fields, and think of how many mornings since have offered some quieter echo of that same falling white, a lighter dusting here, a brief flurry there, each one drawing the family back, if only for a moment, to that same window, that same watching. Think of William's cart rolling out down that same lane so many separate times across these months, sometimes easily, sometimes with real effort against the drifts, always eventually returning, always eventually bringing him back through that same door, into that same warm, waiting kitchen. Think of Sarah's hands moving through flour and through wool and through the pages of a letter to her sister, through so many small daily motions that any single one of them would seem hardly worth mentioning, and yet together, across a whole winter's accumulated repetition, amount to something that kept an entire family fed and clothed and warm through months that could, without this steady daily labour, have gone very differently indeed. Think of the children Grace and Ted, who began this season pressed against a cold window watching the first snow fall with wide, uncomplicated wonder, and who end it, months later, taller by some small unnoticed increment, a little more capable with a needle or a whittling knife than they were back in November, having absorbed, across all these ordinary, repeated evenings, something about patience and care and the quiet satisfaction of small tasks properly done, lessons neither of them could name, if asked, but that will likely stay with them, in some form, for the whole of their lives. And think too of the fire itself, that single steady presence at the centre of every single day this account has touched on, built fresh each cold morning from whatever coals survived the night, fed and watched and adjusted through every hour that followed, banked low each evening to carry its warmth safely through to the next dawn, never once, across this whole long season, allowed to fail entirely. There is something in that unbroken thread, that single continuous fire maintained across so many individual days, that stands in, if you want it to, for the whole larger effort this household made across the whole winter, small, constant, unremarkable acts of care, repeated so faithfully and for so long that they became in the end indistinguishable from love itself. Let me stay a little longer inside this last quiet hour before we let the story finally rest, because I think it deserves one more visit before we close. There is a particular quality to the very last hour of a night like this one, the fire banked down to its lowest steady glow, the household above settled fully into sleep, that feels, if you sit with it long enough, almost outside of time altogether, no longer quite belonging to any single evening among the many this winter has offered, but standing instead for all of them at once. Every banked fire and every quiet, settled house this family has shared across the whole long cold season, folded together into this one final representative stillness. The coals shift very slightly now and then, a soft settling sound with nothing urgent in it, and somewhere above, faint enough to be more felt than properly heard, the old timbers continue their own slow nighttime conversation with the cold outside, the same conversation they have carried on every single night since the first snow fell, patient and unhurried and entirely unbothered by how many more such nights still lie ahead before spring finally, fully arrives. Outside, past the shuttered window, the frost continues its own quiet work, spreading its delicate branching patterns across whatever glass it can reach, indifferent to whether anyone is awake to admire it, the same patient, beautiful, entirely unwitnessed process that has repeated itself, in some form, on nearly every cold night this whole season has offered. The stars overhead, if you were out beneath them, would show that same hard, close brightness that has become, across these many months, one of the quiet signature pleasures of the deepest winter nights, indifferent, vast, and somehow, despite their vastness, deeply companionable to anyone willing to simply stand beneath them a while and look up. Somewhere further off, past the edge of this one small cottage's particular circle of warmth and light, the rest of the sleeping village holds its own version of this same quiet, every household along the lane settled, by this hour, into whatever version of this same nightly stillness its own particular family has built across this same long season. Banked fires and sleeping children and the same patient, star-filled cold pressing gently against every darkened window in the parish. There is something genuinely comforting in imagining this, if you let yourself, the whole small scattered community held together, this deep in the night, by nothing more than the shared fact of everyone, everywhere along this lane, doing more or less the same quiet, necessary things to get their own households safely through until morning. And morning, when it eventually comes to this particular cottage, will bring with it exactly what every morning across this whole long winter has brought. A fire to be coaxed back up from its overnight coals, water to be fetched, a family to be fed and dressed and set gently in motion for whatever the day happens to ask of them, the same patient rhythm repeating itself one more time, as it has repeated itself so many hundreds of times already across this season, and will continue repeating, in some form, for as long as this small stone cottage stands here at the edge of this particular English village, holding whatever family happens, in whatever year, to call it home through whatever winter happens to be passing. But for tonight, this one particular night, none of that morning's coming business has arrived yet. For tonight, there is only this, the low glow of banked coals settling gently toward ash, the faint familiar creak of old timber cooling in the dark, the quiet, steady breathing of a family safely asleep above a fire that has, across every single night of this whole demanding season, done exactly what it was asked to do. For tonight, there is only the frost spreading its slow, patient patterns across a cold window nobody is awake to watch, and the stars turning, slow and silent and entirely indifferent, above a small stone cottage that has weathered, once again, whatever this particular winter chose to bring it. There is a particular comfort held inside a house like this one, on a night like this one, a fire tended with real care, a bed warmed against the cold before anyone climbs into it, a household held together, night after ordinary night, by nothing more dramatic than steady, patient, unremarkable love. That is, in the end, what this whole long season has really been about, underneath all its snow and frost and firelight, a small stone cottage and the 4 people inside it, doing, one ordinary day at a time, exactly what needed doing to keep each other warm. The fire has burned down now to something barely more than a whisper of orange beneath its grey coating of ash, still warm, still faintly glowing, still doing its own last quiet work through these final hours before dawn, the way it has done every single night since the season's first snowfall settled soft and heavy over the sleeping fields outside. Upstairs, Grace has turned once in her sleep and settled again, one hand still loosely curled around the edge of her blanket. Ted has not moved at all in some time, deep in the particular untroubled sleep that only a full, active, thoroughly tired 6-year-old ever quite manages. And in the room below them, William and Sarah sleep too now, their own quiet breathing settled into that same unhurried rhythm the whole house seems to share on nights like this one, a rhythm built from months of shared hard work, and shared warmth, and shared patient care for one another, and for the 2 small lives entrusted to them through every one of this winter's coldest, darkest hours. Outside, the frost keeps working, the stars keep turning, and somewhere beneath all of it, deep in the quiet dark of this one particular cottage, at the edge of this one particular English village, on this one particular night that stands, in its own small way, for every night this whole long winter has offered, a family sleeps on, safe and warm, held together by nothing more and nothing less than the same steady, patient care that has carried them, one ordinary day at a time, all the way from that first heavy snowfall to this quiet, settled, deeply peaceful edge of spring. I think if you have stayed with me this far, through every snowfall and every quiet fireside evening and every small ordinary task this household carried out across a whole long season, you are very likely close to sleep yourself now, and I want to honour that properly rather than pulling you back into any more detail. So let me simply stay here a while longer, quietly, alongside you, saying nothing more elaborate than this. The fire is warm, the house is safe, the family sleeps soundly, undisturbed, exactly as they have every ordinary night before this one, and wherever you are, in whatever room, under whatever blanket, at whatever hour this particular night finds you, I hope that same warmth and that same safety have settled fully into you as well, carrying you gently now the rest of the way down into your own well-earned rest. You do not need to hold on to any of it anymore. Not the woodpile, not the careful arithmetic of a winter's stores, not even the names of the family who has kept you company this whole night through. You can simply let it all soften now, the way the fire itself has softened, down past flame and down past glow, into something quieter, something without edges, something very much like sleep. Somewhere in that small stone cottage, beneath the low thatch and the wide, star-scattered sky above it, 4 people breathe slowly and steadily together, held safely inside a life built one ordinary day at a time, through cold and frost and firelight, all the way to this settled, peaceful edge of spring. And I hope, wherever your own night has found you, that you are settling now into that same kind of peace, warm and unhurried and entirely ready for rest. Nothing left now to carry, nothing left now to do, nothing left now but this, the quiet, the dark, the slow steady pull towards sleep. Good night.